The call came at 7:43 in the morning, and Marcus was already awake. He had been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at nothing in particular, the way he sometimes did, when the weight of something he could not name pressed down on him from the inside. It was not insomnia in the medical sense. His doctor had asked him about it once, carefully, the way doctors ask careful questions, and Marcus had said he slept fine, which was partially true. He slept. He just woke early, and the early hours had a texture to them that the rest of the day did not, a particular quality of quiet, in which the weight was louder than it was when other things competed with it. It was Daniel, his manager, which was unusual because Daniel never called before 9. Daniel was a man of reliable routines, the kind of manager who respected the boundary between the working day and the hours before it. The sound of Daniel's voice on the phone, careful, considered, choosing each word with a deliberateness Marcus recognized as the manner of a man delivering news, told Marcus immediately that something had happened, and not something small. There had been a complaint. Marcus stood up from the kitchen table slowly. He set the cold coffee in the sink. He listened. A client had contacted the company the previous afternoon to report that during a routine review call, Marcus had made the client feel, in the client's own words, like they were being studied rather than assisted. The client had been careful with their language. The complaint had not used the word hostile, had not suggested anything threatening. They had used the phrase an uncomfortable amount of intensity, and asked whether someone else might handle the account going forward. Daniel delivered this information with the measured tone of a man who had spent several hours deciding exactly how to say it. Marcus listened to all of it without speaking. When Daniel finished, there was a silence that Marcus let run to 3 full seconds before he said simply that he understood. He did not apologize, because apologizing required believing you had done something wrong, and Marcus had not done anything wrong. He had asked the client several direct questions, because those questions had needed to be asked. He had asked them directly, because directness was the only mode of asking he knew. He had not raised his voice. He had not been unkind. He had simply been himself, and being himself had been, once again, more than the situation could comfortably contain. Daniel said they would talk when Marcus came in. He said it the way you say things to someone you genuinely like and genuinely cannot help, with a warmth that acknowledged the difficulty of the situation without pretending to resolve it. Marcus said goodbye and put the phone on the counter. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. He looked at the window, where the morning outside was doing ordinary morning things. A pale light, some early traffic on the street below, a pigeon on the ledge opposite. Then he took a shower and got dressed and went to work. He was 34 years old. He had worked at the logistics company for 6 years. He had never missed a deadline, never lost a client through incompetence, never submitted a report that wasn't exactly right. He was, in all the ways that could be measured and reported, an excellent employee. But there was something about Marcus that existed outside of measurement, something that sat beneath the competence and the precision and the impeccable work. And this something had a way of surfacing at unexpected moments and making people feel things they were not prepared to feel. Not afraid, not exactly, but aware. Aware in the way you are aware of standing too close to the edge of something. Not in danger, just aware. He had understood this about himself for a long time. He had not always had a name for it. He grew up 3 hours north of the city, in a town where everyone knew your grandfather's name, and where the houses were built close enough together that you could, if the windows were open in summer, hear your neighbors' conversations in the evening. His father had been a man of few words and substantial feelings. Feelings that did not fit the small rooms available to them, and that pressed, consequently, against the walls of their house with a constancy Marcus had grown up breathing like air. He had loved his father without reserve. He had also spent a very large part of his childhood being quietly afraid of him, not because his father was cruel, but because the size of what his father felt, the grief and the weight of it, was something Marcus had never found a way to stand comfortably near without being diminished by it. His mother had left when he was 9. This was the central fact of his early life, the fact around which every other fact organized itself. She did not leave in a dramatic way. There had been no argument on her last night that Marcus could point to later. She had simply been present one morning and absent the next, and his father had told him, in the careful and devastating way of parents trying to protect their children from information that cannot be protected against, that she needed to find something she couldn't find here. Marcus had nodded. He had eaten his breakfast. He had gone to school. He had carried that sentence for the next 25 years, turning it over in different lights, never fully arriving at a version of it that didn't hurt. He had a childhood friend named Owen who had been his closest companion through school and into adulthood. Owen was everything Marcus was not in the social sense. Easy with people, fast to laugh, able to walk into a room of strangers and emerge 20 minutes later, knowing everyone's name and several things about their families. Marcus had studied Owen with the focused attention he gave to everything, and had concluded, by about age 15, that there were some qualities in people that were native and could not be learned, and that Owen's ease was one of them, and that the thing in Marcus that was the opposite of that ease was also native and could not be unlearned. He had made his peace with this conclusion, not happily, not all at once, but he had made it. Owen lived in a different city now. They spoke twice a year, sometimes 3 times, and the calls were warm but brief, and always ended with the slightly constrained feeling of 2 people who would like to say more, and have not yet figured out how to say it. He had been in 2 significant relationships. The first had been with a woman named Clara, who was intelligent and perceptive, and who had, for 2 years, made a genuine and sustained effort to find her way into the parts of Marcus that he kept closed. When she left, she told him she felt like she had been standing outside a house she was never invited into. He had said he understood. The second relationship had been with a man named Liam, who was patient by nature, and who had stretched the outer limits of that patience over the course of a year and a half, before concluding that he had reached them. Liam had said, on his way out, something that Marcus returned to often: "You're not broken. You're waiting for something. I just don't know what it is." He had a neighbor named Ben who had become, over the years of proximity and quiet Sunday evening meals, something close to a genuine friend. Ben cooked simply and well, and never pushed for conversation beyond what Marcus was ready to offer, which was exactly the right quality in a neighbor, and exactly the quality that made the relationship work. He had a woman from his running group named Sophie, who made him laugh without trying to, which was rarer than it sounded. He had Finn at work, who was relentlessly cheerful, in a way that Marcus might have found exhausting coming from anyone else but found, in Finn, simply characteristic and even occasionally comforting. He had a life, a real one, with real people in it. He was not a man who sat alone in the dark, but there was a territory at the center of him that remained unshared, not because he was actively hiding it, but because no one had yet found a way to sit in it with him. He had heard himself described, over the years, in various ways: too intense, hard to read, the kind of person who makes you feel like you're being evaluated just by being near him. He had overheard that last one, standing on the other side of a partition wall in the office break room, and had stood there for a moment holding his coffee, and then had returned to his desk and opened a spreadsheet, and worked through the afternoon, without speaking to anyone if he could help it. He ran in the mornings, fast, on the river path, in the particular quiet of early hours before the city fully gathered itself. Running was the thing that gave the weight somewhere to go, without requiring him to understand it, or manage it, or present it in a form that other people could comfortably receive. He only had to move. The weight moved with him and came, if not out, then at least to the surface, where the air could reach it. He lived in an apartment with large windows, and too many books, and a plant he had managed to keep alive for 3 years, through sheer attentiveness, which he considered one of his more unlikely achievements. He cooked because cooking required focus, and focus was a resource he had in abundance. He slept adequately if not deeply. He worked hard, and showed up on time, and remembered every detail of every project he had ever been responsible for, and managed to be simultaneously one of the most valuable and one of the most difficult people in his professional environment. People at his workplace had a word for him that they used when he was not in the room. He ran cold. They said it the way you note the temperature of a building, without malice, just as useful information. He had overheard it. He had decided, over several days of turning it over, that it was not accurate, and that the people who said it were confusing control with coldness, which was a common mistake that he did not blame them for, but that was, nonetheless, a mistake. He called what lived inside him the wolf, because it was the most accurate word he had found, after years of searching for one. Not because it was dangerous, not in the way that word might suggest, but because it was large and old, and came without invitation, and had its own sense of when to appear, and because it was, in the most precise sense, wild, Not untamed in the sense of chaos, but untamed in the sense of belonging to a nature that was not entirely his to manage. It had been shaped by his father's silences and his mother's leaving, and 9 years old, on an ordinary morning, with no explanation, and 2 relationships that had each ended with some version of, "You are too much for the space I have available." The wolf was made of all of that. It was grief, yes, but it was also the specific loneliness of a man who had never once, in his adult life, had someone choose to remain in the room when the wolf arrived. He had decided, sometime around his 32nd year, that this was simply the arrangement, that some people move through the world in a way that fit the available spaces, and that he was not that kind of person, and that this was not only a fault but simply a shape. He did not know, on the morning this story begins, that something was coming. He could not have known. He only knew that it was Tuesday, and that Daniel had called early, and that the day was going to begin with a conversation he had not wanted to have. He went to work. He had the conversation. He returned to his desk. He worked through the afternoon with the sustained focus that was his only reliable response to everything that arrived in his life, wearing the wrong shape. He walked home at 6, in the unremarkable city evening, past people who did not look at him, and buildings that were doing nothing remarkable, and the ordinary noise of a city conducting its ordinary business. He made dinner. He ate. He turned on no music, and watched no television, and sat with the particular evening quiet that he had learned, over many years, was not empty, but full of things that had no other time to be heard. He thought about the phone call from Daniel later that evening, not with bitterness, but with the specific, clear-eyed quality he brought to self-examination. He had been reviewing calls, reviewing situations, reviewing himself with this same unflinching attention since he was old enough to examine things, and what he had always found, and found again tonight, was that there was no version of the Marcus who had made those calls in which something fundamentally different was said. He was who he was. He operated as he operated. The client had not been lied to or mistreated or poorly served. The client had been given the full weight of Marcus's attention, which was, apparently, heavier than some people could comfortably receive. He had long since stopped trying to make the attention lighter. He had tried, in his 20s, to develop a kind of social veneer, the light touch, the easy laugh, the performance of casual, that he had observed in people who seemed to move through the world more smoothly. He had abandoned this project after 2 years because it produced, in him, an exhaustion that was worse than the problem it was supposed to solve, and because it seemed to him, in the honest accounting that was his default mode, that performing a different version of himself was not a solution, but a different kind of problem. People who knew the performed version and then encountered the real version were more confused than people who simply encountered the real version from the beginning. This had been Clara's experience. Clara had met the version of Marcus that he had been trying to make easier for the world to receive, and then she had met the rest of him, and the gap between those two things had been part of what made the leaving feel, to her, like a kind of betrayal, even though it wasn't. He had learned from that. He no longer offered a surface version. He was, from the beginning, exactly what he was, which meant that the people who stayed were the people who had stayed, knowing what they were staying for. He was, as he walked home and cooked dinner and ate it at his kitchen table, with a book open in front of him that he was not reading, a man who had made a complete accounting of his own nature and who had arrived, through that accounting, at a kind of steady, unromantic acceptance of it. He was not happy about all of it. He was not at peace with all of it. But he understood it, and he had stopped expecting it to be different, and this was, he believed, the most honest position available to him. What he had not stopped, because he could not stop it, was the private wonder about what it would be like if any of it were otherwise, if the weight were lighter, if the wolf arrived less often, if there were someone who could look at the whole of him without needing to step back. This wonder lived somewhere below the acceptance, below the practical peace he had made with himself, and he acknowledged it the way he acknowledged most things that were inconvenient but real, briefly, precisely, without letting it run any longer than it needed to. He thought, before he slept, about the phrase, an uncomfortable amount of intensity. He considered it the way he considered everything, completely, honestly, without the useful mercy of dismissing it. He held it up and looked at it, and tried to find the version of himself that was capable of reducing that quality to a level that other people could comfortably occupy. He could not find that version. He was not sure it existed. He slept. He woke early. He made coffee. He went to work. He did not know that someone had arrived in his building overnight. Not physically, not yet, but in the way that significant people arrive before you are aware of them. Someone who was, at that very moment, drinking tea in a flat on the other side of the city and reading a contract for a new position that would put her 8 feet from Marcus's desk beginning the following Tuesday. He did not know that this person had a particular way of looking at the world that was, in the most specific and useful sense, the opposite of how the world had looked at him. He did not know any of this. He only knew it was Wednesday, and the coffee was hot, and there was work to do, and that this was, as it had always been, enough. Nadia Holt arrived on a Tuesday, which was, as she later reflected, exactly the right day to start somewhere new. Mondays carried too much expectation. Everyone on a Monday was still negotiating with the week ahead, still organizing themselves around its demands, and there was no room in that process for the quiet attention that starting somewhere new actually required. Tuesdays were different. Tuesdays had already settled. The week had made its commitments and relaxed into them, and there was a kind of ordinary ease on a Tuesday that made it possible to simply walk into a place and look at it honestly, rather than through the gauze of ceremony. She carried a canvas bag that had a book in it and a small plant she was giving to whoever sat nearest her new desk, and a coffee she had bought on the corner, because buying coffee on the first day somewhere new was something she had been doing since her first job and had never stopped doing, not for any meaningful reason, but because rituals are their own kind of meaning, and this one was hers. She was 31 years old. She had worked in marketing for 3 years, and then in supply chain management for 2, and now in logistics, which surprised everyone, she told, because logistics did not look like the career path of a woman who had studied literature at university, and who read novels on her lunch break, and who had a way of watching conversations that suggested she found other people genuinely, rather than professionally, interesting. But she had explained it to Cole once, in a way that made complete sense to him, which was that she was interested in systems, in the patterns that looked like chaos from the outside and turned out, when you paid real attention, to be something with a shape. Logistics was nothing but that, the movement of things from one place to another, which was orderly chaos, which was the thing she understood best. She had moved 3 times in 5 years, not because she was restless but because she was curious, and each new position had offered a different angle on the way things worked, and she was not yet at the point in her life where she had exhausted curiosity in favor of the other qualities that make people stay in one place for a long time. She would get there, probably. She was not in a rush. The logistics department was on the 4th floor of a building she had been in once before, for an interview, and that looked, now that she was arriving to work in it, rather than to be assessed in it, like what it was. A real place where people spent real days doing work that mattered to them, in the moderate but genuine way that work matters to people who take it seriously, but do not confuse it with everything. There were plants on the windowsills in various stages of survival. Someone had made a handwritten sign for the coffee machine. The carpet had the specific worn look of carpet that has hosted many years of honest effort. A man named Finn introduced himself within 3 minutes of her arrival, with the speed and warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed the occasion of a new person. He showed her where the good printer was, told her which meeting room had a view and which had a persistent smell, and mentioned that there was leftover birthday cake in the break room from the day before. She thanked him and liked him immediately. She found her desk, set up her computer, and looked around the room. It was during this initial survey, the inventory taking that new arrivals perform, reading the room's personalities from their objects and habits, and the particular way people hold themselves in a familiar space, that she first noticed Marcus. He was sitting at his desk at the far end of the open floor, reading something on his screen with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely engaged rather than appearing to be, and there was nothing designed about his posture or his expression. He was not performing anything. He was simply there, and something about the quality of his presence caught her attention, in the way that a very clear note catches your attention in a room full of sound. He was still in a way that spoke not of calm, but of discipline. The difference was significant to her, in the same way the difference between a quiet room and an empty room was significant. One had something in it, the other didn't. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her computer, and logged in and began the ordinary work of the first day. It was 3 days before they spoke, and the occasion was the coffee machine. which had been left empty in defiance of the note on the side of it, and Nadia was in the process of refilling the water reservoir when Marcus arrived to find it not yet operational. He stood for a moment in the way she was beginning to recognize, completely still, not fidgeting, not performing the small theater of impatience, and then he said, without softening it into a pleasantry, "How long does it take?" She said approximately 4 minutes once it heated up. He said thank you. They both waited. The machine made its preparatory sounds. She said she was Nadia, and that she had started Tuesday. He said he knew, and that he was Marcus. She said she knew. He looked at her directly when she said it, with the full weight of his attention, and she looked back, and did not look away, and neither did he. And the machine made the sound that meant the coffee was ready, and they got their coffee and went back to their desks. 4 sentences between them, a shared silence, a coffee machine. But she went back to her desk, thinking about the quality of that silence, and what it had and hadn't contained, and what she decided it had not contained was any form of social management, no performance of ease, no careful presentation of a version of himself arranged to be non-threatening or approachable, or whatever quality the occasion was supposed to call for. He had simply been what he was, directly and without coding, and she found this, in the specific and considered way she found things, interesting. Over the next 12 days they accumulated the small interactions of proximity, a question about a shared supplier database, a nod in the corridor, an email about a jointly managed report. She was paying attention. In the quiet way she paid attention to things that interested her, and she was building a picture. Not consciously, and not strategically. She did not operate that way. But the picture was building itself from the material she was receiving, and what the material told her was this. Marcus was a person whose surface did not reflect what was underneath, and what was underneath was not what most people assumed when they looked at the surface. He remembered everything, every detail of every project, every number on every report, every name connected to every account. Not in a showy way. He did not deploy this memory to demonstrate intelligence or to position himself above others. He used it the way someone uses a useful tool, quietly, precisely, only when it was needed, and for the work, rather than for any benefit to his own image. This told her something about the relationship between his inner life and his outer presentation. He was not interested in being perceived as capable. He was simply interested in being capable. She noticed that when something in the office went wrong, a supplier missed a delivery window, a system error created a cascade of small emergencies. Marcus was the calmest person in the room. Not coldly calm, purposefully calm. His voice dropped and slowed rather than rising, and he moved through the problem with the focused, methodical attention of someone who found clarity in difficulty, rather than being overwhelmed by it. Several of her colleagues moved toward panic in those moments, which was understandable but not useful. Marcus moved toward the problem. This too told her something. She noticed that Finn talked to him regularly, and that Marcus responded to Finn's cheerfulness with something she could only describe as dry affection, not warm in the obvious sense, but consistent, which was its own kind of warmth. She noticed that he ate lunch alone most days, not unhappily, but with the settled quality of a man who was not waiting for something better to happen. She noticed that when something made him think, a question with an interesting answer, a problem that required more than one pass, his face changed in a very specific way, a slight sharpening of attention that was not visible to someone who wasn't looking carefully, but was very visible to someone who was. She told Cole about him. In the partial and imprecise way she told Cole things that were still forming. They were at dinner on a Wednesday, which was their usual dinner, and Cole asked about the new job and the new people in the way he always asked, with genuine interest, because Cole's interest in the details of Nadia's life was one of his more reliable qualities. She said there was someone she was still working out. Cole asked what that meant. She sat with the question for a moment, which he knew to wait for. Then she said it meant she hadn't found the frequency yet. Cole said, "Good or difficult?" She thought about it. "I don't think those are the options," she said. Cole nodded. He knew what she meant by this because he had known her long enough to know how her mind worked, which was that she divided people not into good and difficult, but into those who were what they appeared to be, and those who had more going on than the surface showed. The second category interested her more than the first. She ran the river path for the first time that Saturday morning, not because of Marcus. She had been meaning to run it for weeks, but she thought about him during it. in the unfocused, sideways way you think about things that have not yet resolved into a question you know how to answer. She thought about his stillness, about the way he had looked at her over the coffee machine, as if her looking back were the most interesting thing that had happened to him that morning. Not because he was attracted to her, she had no sense of that yet, but because it was unexpected, as if he was accustomed to being looked at carefully by people who then looked away. She was on the path for 40 minutes, and she ran most of it thinking about nothing in particular, and some of it thinking about this, and by the time she was back at her building she had decided something, which was not a decision about Marcus exactly, but about her own approach to him, which was simply that she would pay attention. She would look, and she would not look away when looking back might have been the easier choice. She would let the picture build at its own pace, and she would not do the thing she sometimes caught herself doing, which was deciding what someone was before she had sufficient information to know. She had learned, in the years before this job, a particular way of entering a new professional environment. It was not a strategy she had designed consciously, but one that had developed naturally, through the accumulation of several beginnings, and what they had taught her. The key was to be present before you were visible, not to hide, not to perform invisibility, but to make yourself genuinely available to the room. Available in the sense of being receptive, attending, asking nothing from the room in return, while it organized itself around your presence. Most new arrivals wanted to be noticed. Nadia had discovered that being receptive was more useful than being noticed, that the information available to someone who was attending without requiring attention was richer than the information available to someone who was performing their presence. She used this approach in the first days and it served her well. She learned the structure of the team quickly, not from the organizational chart, which was a map of the formal version of things, but from the way people oriented themselves in the room, whose opinion was sought before decisions were made, which conversations happened in the break room, rather than in meetings. She learned that Finn was the social connective tissue of the department, the person through whom most informal information traveled. She learned that Daniel managed with a quiet authority that people trusted. She learned that the work was more interesting than it appeared from the outside, that the problems within it had genuine complexity, and that the people who did it well were people who found complexity satisfying rather than exhausting. And she kept returning, in her attention, to Marcus. Not obsessively. Not in the way of someone who has decided something before they have enough information to decide it, but with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that she sensed were worth attending to, things that would reveal something important about the room she was learning, things that had more in them than their surface showed. Marcus was that kind of thing. She could feel it in the particular way she could feel things before she could explain them. The same way she had always been able to feel the temperature of a space before she had been in it long enough to measure it. She made no conclusions. She only paid attention. Cole asked her again about Marcus in their third Wednesday dinner. He had not forgotten, because Cole did not forget things that involved Nadia's attention, which he tracked with the affectionate vigilance of someone who cared about her enough to notice where she was looking. She said she was still working on it. He asked if it was interesting. She said yes. He said that was usually her word for things that mattered to her, before she had decided why, which was accurate, and which she acknowledged was accurate. He did not push. Cole was a person who knew the difference between inquiry and pressure, and he preferred the former. She went home from their Wednesday dinner and sat at her kitchen table and thought about the river path and the coffee machine and the way Marcus looked at things, directly, completely, without the social management that most people applied to their looking, as if looking were something that required apology or dilution. He looked at things the way she looked at things, she realized, with the same quality of attention. Full attention, without the usual percentage held back for self-monitoring. She was not used to encountering that quality in other people. It was something she was more accustomed to being alone in. She went home, she showered, she made tea, and sat at her kitchen table with the book she was reading, and outside the window the city continued its Saturday business, and Nadia thought that next week would probably be interesting, and she was right, though not in any way she could have specifically anticipated. She also noticed, from across the room on an ordinary afternoon, that Marcus was the person who noticed when Finn was having a difficult day, before Finn said anything about it. This was not performance. He did not make the noticing public. She saw him simply refill Finn's water bottle and set it on Finn's desk without comment, and Finn had looked up and said thanks quietly, and Marcus had already returned to his own work. This small thing told her a great deal. It told her that the attention he paid to the world was not selective. not reserved for people he liked or for his own interests. It was simply how he moved through spaces where other people existed. He paid attention, because paying attention was what you did. She did not know, sitting there, that Marcus was at that very moment on the same path she had just left, running it in the cold morning air, and going faster than was probably wise, and that he was thinking about nothing he could name, and everything that he carried, and that he had no idea that an encounter was coming that would, quietly and without announcement, change the entire landscape of what carrying something alone could mean. The invitation to Finn's gathering had been extended to the whole department in the relaxed, non-mandatory way that Finn extended all invitations, as a genuine offer rather than a social obligation, which was why people tended to accept it. His apartment was 2 streets from the office and had a kitchen large enough to function as a social space, and a living room full of the books and records and slightly mismatched furniture of a man who had been living alone contentedly for many years. The gatherings were simple. People came, they brought things, they talked, they went home when they wanted to. There was nothing ceremonial about it. Marcus attended one of these gatherings every few months. He had developed over the years a clear sense of the upper limit of social endurance that worked for him, the point past which the effort of being in a room full of other people's energy began to cost more than it gave back, and Finn's gatherings were reliably within that limit. He never stayed past 10. He usually found one person to talk to genuinely, and let the rest of the evening operate at whatever distance suited it. He had been doing this long enough that no one questioned his early departures or expected him to navigate the whole room. He had, without formally announcing it, established a version of the gathering that worked for him, and Finn, who was perceptive in the uncomplicated way of people with large amounts of goodwill, had long since made peace with it. Nadia arrived at 7:30 with a bottle of wine and the specific ease of someone who is naturally comfortable in social situations, not because she requires nothing of them, but because she is genuinely curious about the people in them, and that curiosity turns the work of socializing into something more like enjoyment. She had changed after work into something comfortable, nothing deliberate, the way you dress when you're going somewhere familiar even when it's new. And she moved into Finn's apartment the way she moved into most spaces, attentively, without hurry, taking the measure of the room before deciding where to go in it. She said hello to Finn, who was delighted to see her, and accepted a glass of something from the kitchen, and began the part of a gathering she liked best, which was the early part when everything was still forming, and people had not yet settled into their fixed positions for the evening. This was when you could move between conversations without it being an interruption, when the whole room was still in motion, and she used the motion to learn things she wouldn't have access to later. She talked to a woman from accounts she hadn't met yet, whose name was Faye, who had worked at the company for 9 years, and had opinions about the coffee machine that were detailed and strongly held. She talked to a man from the data team who had recently moved to the city from somewhere smaller, and was still negotiating the noise of it. She talked to Finn for a while in the kitchen about nothing consequential. Marcus arrived at 20 minutes to 8. She saw him come in and watched. In the peripheral, non-obvious way she watched things. The particular sequence of his arrival. The complete scan of the room. The identification of people he knew. The navigation to a position that was present without being central, near the bookshelves on the far wall, where the noise was somewhat lower and there was a sight line to most of the room. She let about 25 minutes pass before she made her way to him. Not from strategy. She was in a conversation that needed finishing, and when it finished, the person she most wanted to talk to was Marcus, and so that was where she went. They talked about work first, which was the natural territory between people who have not yet found their way to the other territories. There was a supplier they both had views about, and a database migration that was consuming more hours than it should have, and these subjects were useful, not because they were interesting in themselves, but because they gave each person a chance to hear how the other one thought. This was what conversation was, at its core, in Nadia's view. Not the exchange of information, but the exchange of methods. How do you approach things? How do you hold a problem when it arrives? What do you do with the parts of it that don't fit? She asked him about the running, because she had seen him on the path that morning from across the road, recognized his stride before she recognized his face, and he told her about it in the direct, specific way he said everything. The river path, 4 miles, most mornings. Worth doing for the hour of it if for nothing else. She asked what made it worth it. He said it was the only part of the day where he was moving and nothing was expected of him. She said, "Not even yourself?" He was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not a pause for effect. Then he said, "That's a good question," and did not follow it with an answer, and she did not press him for one. And between those two things, the unanswered question and the space she left for it, something shifted slightly in the quality of the conversation, the way a key shifts in a lock just before it turns. It was in this new quality of the conversation that it happened. A man on the other side of the room, she learned his name later, one of the sales team, a man named Ethan who was not unkind but who had the social habit of speaking before he thought, said something about a mutual acquaintance who had recently gone through a significant loss. Ethan said, in the specific careless way of people who have not thought carefully about grief, because grief has not yet found them, that at a certain point it was a choice, that some people, he said, just decide not to move on. He said it lightly. He was making conversation. The people around him nodded vaguely or moved to other subjects, the way people in a room move past things that do not land in them. It landed in Marcus. Nadia was close enough to see the moment it arrived. Close enough to see the precise, small, instantaneous shift, the jaw that tightened, the hands that went from loose around his glass to completely still, and behind his eyes, something that moved through him, like a change in the internal weather of a place that has its own climate entirely. It was not rage. It was not the visible performance of anger. It was older and heavier and quieter than anger, and it had a gravity to it that changed the atmosphere in a small radius around them. Not dramatically, but measurably, the way pressure changes in a room before a storm that hasn't arrived yet. People in the immediate area felt it without locating it. A nearby conversation pivoted to a different subject. Someone laughed slightly too loudly at something. Ethan himself looked briefly puzzled, in the way people look when they sense they have struck something without being able to see what it was or why it struck. Nadia looked at Marcus. She did not arrange her face into an expression of managed concern. She did not scan the room to find a more comfortable location. She did not do any of the things that were available to her in that moment. The polite fiction of not having noticed, the graceful exit toward a different conversation, the soft change of subject that would release them both from the moment. She simply looked at him, steadily, with the same direct attention she brought to everything, and she did not move. He looked back. The room around them continued being the room. Finn laughed at something in the kitchen. Music played at a low volume from the corner. The gathering did its gathering things, and Marcus and Nadia stood in 4 seconds of eye contact that contained, in the way certain seconds do, more than most 4-hour conversations. What she saw in those seconds, the wolf. Not the surface behavior of a man who was upset in an ordinary way. Something much older and more essential than that. Something that had been built over years and that had arrived, as it always arrived, without invitation and without interest in being convenient. She saw it completely, and she held the eye contact, and she did not flinch, and she did not look for the exit. What he saw, a person who had been given every available reason and every available social permission to look away, and who had not. He had never seen that before. Not in this context, not in this particular moment. He had seen people be kind to him afterward, and patient with him in general, and considerate in the management of him, but he had never seen someone simply hold the moment without trying to change it. It lasted 4 seconds, perhaps 5. Then Nadia reached to the side, where there was a bread basket on the small table beside them, and she held it toward him. She said, "Here," just the one word, and it was not loaded with any of the weight of the last several seconds. It was simply an offer of bread, made in the tone of an ordinary moment between people who are fine, and it was the most precisely right thing she could have done, because it said, without saying anything, that she had seen what had happened, and she was not going anywhere, and they did not need to make anything of it. He looked at the basket. He took a piece of bread. He said thank you. They stood there for perhaps another 10 minutes and talked about something practical. A delivery timeline, she thought, or possibly something about the park near the office, and neither of them acknowledged what had happened, and neither of them needed to, because it had been acknowledged already, in the only language that mattered. Marcus said, about 9:15, that he was going to call it an evening. He said it naturally, without the performance of regret. He said goodbye to Finn, and exchanged a word with a couple of other colleagues, and left the way he always left, quietly, without ceremony. The door closed behind him. Nadia stayed for another 40 minutes. She talked to Faye again, who had more opinions about the coffee machine. She talked to someone from the building's ground floor whom she hadn't met before. She was present in the room, and present in the conversations, and there was nothing on her face, or in her manner, that would have told anyone in the room what she was thinking. What she was thinking, on the inside, in the quiet space behind the ordinary social evening, she was thinking about those seconds. About what she had seen, and what she had done, and why she had done it. She was not a dramatic person. She did not romanticize difficulty, or seek it out. She was not someone who was drawn to complicated situations, because the complication itself was interesting. What had kept her still in those seconds was not any of those things. It was simply that she had looked at Marcus, and the wolf had arrived, and she had found, to her own honest surprise, nothing in her that wanted to be somewhere else. Not relief that it wasn't directed at her. Not discomfort that required management. Something more like recognition. Recognition that this was something real, and that real things deserved to be met without looking away. She drove home through the quiet late streets and made tea, and sat in her kitchen, and thought about it more carefully. She thought about the particular quality of his stillness in those 4 seconds. Not the stillness of someone restraining themselves, but the stillness of someone who had suddenly encountered something unexpected. The wolf had looked at her when she hadn't looked away, and it had paused. She was certain of that. It had paused in a way that suggested it was not accustomed to being looked at, rather than fled from, and that the looking had done something to it. Not fixed it, not calmed it, simply surprised it. She picked up her phone and found his number and held it for a moment. Then she typed, "I make good tea if you ever need somewhere to be." She read it back once. It was right. It said the right things and none of the wrong things, and it did not demand anything from him in response. She sent it. She put her phone face down and drank her tea. She did not think about whether he would reply. She had said a true thing, and sent it, and the rest was not hers to manage. She had noticed something in the weeks before Finn's gathering that she had not yet named. She had noticed that Marcus occupied the office differently on difficult days and on ordinary days. Not dramatically differently, not in a way that most people would have registered, but differently in the way that a room is different when the weather has changed outside, even if you cannot see the weather from where you are. The specific quality of his stillness changed. On ordinary days it was the stillness of someone who was focused outward, concentrated on the work, alert to what was happening in the room, present in the specific and attentive way she had come to recognize as simply how he was. On difficult days the stillness turned inward, became denser, as if the energy that was normally distributed across his attention had been redirected somewhere inside, leaving less available to the surface. She had seen this happen 3 times in the weeks before the gathering. Each time, the people around him responded in the same way she had noticed people responding to Marcus generally, with a slight, unconscious increase in the space they maintained. A small adjustment that was not unkind, but was unmistakable. They widened the gap. They found reasons to be in a different part of the floor. They did not do this cruelly. They did it the way you do any self-protective thing, automatically, and without requiring a decision about it. What Nadia did, on those days, was nothing different. She worked at her desk, she went about the day. She did not narrow the gap or widen it. This was not a deliberate choice at the time. She had not made a decision about how to behave toward Marcus on his difficult days. She had simply gone on doing what she always did, which was to be present in the space she was in, without requiring the space to be different from what it was. She thought about this in the car on the way home from Finn's. She thought about it carefully, in the analytical way she thought about things that seemed important. She had been in that gathering for 2 hours before the moment happened, and she had talked to 6 or 7 different people, and she had found some of them interesting, and some of them pleasant, and some of them both, and none of them had produced in her the specific quality of attention she found herself giving to Marcus. Not because the others were less interesting as people, because something about Marcus asked of her a different kind of looking, not the looking you do to learn about someone, but the looking you do to try to see something clearly that matters to you but is hard to see. She had not expected to find that tonight. She had come to a gathering with low expectations of anything remarkable, and she had found, in 4 seconds of eye contact during which the wolf arrived and she had simply not moved, something she would spend the next several weeks turning over in the way she turned over things that were still unresolved. She went to bed. She slept well, the way she generally slept, which was deeply and without difficulty, because she was someone who had made peace, over the years, with the particular art of letting things be as they were. She did not know, turning out the light, that across the city, A man was sitting on the edge of his bed, reading her message for the fourth time, with the specific expression of someone who has been handed something he does not know how to hold, but is not willing to put down. Marcus knew the pattern the way a navigator knows a coastline, by the exact shape of every feature, by where the shallow water was and where the current ran wrong. He knew it so well that by the morning after Finn's gathering, before anything had been confirmed or denied, he had already begun running through its stages in his mind, like a man reviewing a document he has read many times. The pattern began with a grace period. This was the part where nothing changed on the surface, where the person who had witnessed the wolf continued to behave as they had behaved before, because they were in the processing stage, or because they were kind enough to continue through the existing momentum of the relationship before redirecting it. The grace period lasted different amounts of time with different people. With Clara, it had been 5 days. With Liam, it had been 3. With friends and colleagues, sometimes longer, because professional courtesy demanded a longer wind-down. Then came the adjustment. Messages that arrived a little more slowly. Invitations that did not materialize. Conversations that stayed carefully on the surface, because the surface was now understood to be the only safe territory. And beneath the adjustment, the careful management of a relationship that had been reclassified, from something genuine to something maintained at a distance that both parties understood, though neither named. He was so certain of this that he had already, without deciding to, begun to prepare for it. This was not a conscious strategy. It was something his body did automatically, the same way it braced before cold water. Not choosing to brace, simply bracing. He was organizing himself for the distance before the distance arrived. He ran the river path on Sunday morning, faster than he'd run it in weeks. He passed no one he knew. He came home and showered and ate something, and sat at his desk trying to read. He could not read. He made coffee and stood at the window and watched the street below, where ordinary Sunday things were happening. A couple walking a dog, a delivery van, a woman on a bicycle with a basket. Ordinary Sunday. The kind of Sunday that asked nothing of anyone. His phone showed a silence from Nadia. Not an accusatory silence, not the particular silence that arrives when someone is deciding how to tell you something difficult. Just silence, which was its own kind of information. He made lunch. He ate it at the table. He had a book open in front of him and read 2 pages over the course of 45 minutes, which gave him a sense of how effectively he was concentrating. At 2:30, a message arrived. It was not the message he had been bracing for. It was not the gradual beginning of the withdrawal process. It said simply, "The offer stands, if you want. I'm usually home by 7 on Wednesdays." He read it twice. He put the phone down on the table, face up, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picked it up and read it again. The offer stands. She had said it once, the night before, and she was saying it again today, and the repetition was the thing that caught at him most completely. An impulsive offer, extended in a generous moment, could be easily enough left unfollowed. Most impulsive offers were. The person who made them moved on, and the person who received them understood, because this was a thing that everyone understood without anyone having to say so. But this was not that. She had gotten up on a Sunday and sent the same offer again, unprompted, unrequested. She had not forgotten. She had decided. He was aware, sitting there at his table, that he was being presented with something he did not know how to receive, not because it was threatening or confusing in the ordinary sense, but because it did not fit any of the shapes he had available for it. It was not pity. He knew what pity looked like. The particular softness people developed for him when they had witnessed the wolf and felt sorry for the difficulty of it. This was not that. It was not curiosity in the rubbernecking sense, not the interest of someone who finds darkness interesting in an abstract way. It was something else entirely, something he was not sure he had the right word for, and he was a person who generally had words for things. He typed a reply and deleted it. He typed another one, also deleted it. The third was too casual, and the fourth was too formal, and on the 5th attempt he wrote, "Wednesday works, what time?" He sent it before he could revise it further. She replied in 2 minutes. 7:30. I'll send you the address. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to his book, and this time he managed to read 15 pages, which was still not his usual pace, but was significantly better than 2. Wednesday arrived with the specific slow speed of days you are waiting for. He worked through Monday and Tuesday with his usual focused efficiency, and if Finn noticed that he was slightly less than his usual self, slightly more interior, slightly further from the surfaces of things, Finn was generous enough not to comment on it, though he did bring a small amount of extra pastry on Tuesday morning and leave it at Marcus's desk without explanation, which was Finn's particular way of caring for people. Marcus walked to Nadia's address on Wednesday evening, through streets that had that specific quality of autumn in the city, wet and dark and lit warmly from the windows of restaurants and apartments, the kind of evening that looks better from inside. He had not brought anything, which he second-guessed for the first 4 blocks, and then decided to stop second-guessing. She opened the door without performance, without the arrangement of expression that people sometimes did on answering a door, the assembling of a face that said, "I'm comfortable, and relaxed, and glad you're here." She simply opened it and said, "Come in," and took his jacket, and led him down the hallway into a kitchen that was small and warm, in the particular way of rooms that are genuinely lived in. There were books on the counter, not arranged for appearance. Just there, the way books accumulate in places where someone reads regularly. A plant on the windowsill that was thriving in the specific way of plants that receive consistent attention. A handwritten note on the refrigerator that said, "Eggs," and "Call back Iris," in handwriting that was not decorative but functional. The kitchen smelled like whatever she had made for dinner before he arrived, something with onions and herbs, and the smell was the smell of ordinary real life, and he found, unexpectedly, that it was one of the most comfortable smells he had encountered in a long time. She made tea, quickly and without theater, set 2 mugs on the table, and sat down across from him, and wrapped her hands around her own mug, and he wrapped his hands around his, and outside the kitchen window, the autumn rain was doing what autumn rain does, and the city was full of its city sounds at a muffled distance. She asked how the rest of his week had been. He said fine. He asked about hers. She mentioned the report. He said yes. He'd been looking at it too. They talked about it for a while, in the comfortable way of 2 people who are comfortable with the territory of work, and then the work conversation ran its natural course and ended, and there was a silence. He waited to see what kind of silence it was. He had become expert at the taxonomy of silences, the kind that were waiting to be filled, the kind that were themselves an answer to a question, the kind that were simply pauses in something ongoing. This silence was the 3rd kind. After a while she said, "You don't have to say anything about the other night." He said he knew. She said, "But if you wanted to, that would be all right too." He looked at his mug. He looked at her. He said, "I don't usually talk about it." She said, "Okay." He said, "But I don't think that has served me especially well." He paused, the not talking, as a general strategy. She nodded, in the way she nodded when she meant, "I'm here, continue," not in the way she nodded when she meant, "I understand, and have already concluded something." He told her something. Not everything, not yet, not that night, but something real. Something about his father, and the specific quality of growing up alongside grief, that belonged to someone else, and was too large for the space available, and that had no name at the time. He told it plainly, without self-pity or performance, in the same voice he used for everything, because he had only the one voice. When he finished, there was the kind of silence that comes after something real, and she let it be real, rather than filling it immediately with a response designed to make him feel better, which would have reduced it. Then she said, "Thank you for saying that." He looked at her. "For what?" She said, "For trusting it to this kitchen." He did not know what to do with that sentence. It was the most precisely right thing she could have said, and he did not know how to receive it, so he simply held it in the way you hold something you're not ready to put down. They talked after that about other things. Smaller things, lighter things, the kind of things that fill the comfortable portion of an evening, with someone whose company you find easy, without yet understanding why. He stayed until 9:30. He put on his jacket at the door, and she said get home safe, and he said good night, and walked out into the wet autumn street. He walked the 15 minutes home, and he did not mind the rain at all. He was inside his own thoughts in the specific way that evenings leave you, when they have given you something to think about that is not a problem, not a complication, simply something new. He texted her when he got back. "Thank you for the tea." She replied, "Anytime. I mean that." He stood in his dark hallway, holding his phone, and the apartment was quiet around him, and the city was doing its late-night city things outside, and he stood there, looking at those 4 words, and he knew, in the part of himself that was most honest and had the least tolerance for comfortable lies, that she meant it. That this was not social language functioning as social language, that she had said a thing she intended. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while. He did not feel hopeful exactly, because hope was a word he approached with caution. But he felt something in the vicinity of it, something that occupied the same temperature as hope, that produced the same slightly heightened quality of aliveness. He noted this. He did not do anything with it. He simply let it be there in the dark alongside him, this unexpected small warmth in the chest of a man who had not been certain warmth was still available to him in any uncomplicated form. He had arrived at her building with the specific self-consciousness of a man who had been preparing for this more than he was comfortable admitting. He had changed clothes once and considered changing them again. He had chosen a slightly longer route because the longer route gave him more time inside the walk, which was where he was most able to settle things. By the time he reached her door, he was as settled as he was going to be. Inside her kitchen, the self-consciousness had settled further. Kitchens were useful for this. They were functional spaces, and functionality gave him somewhere to put his attention that was not on himself or on the register of the other person's responses. He had watched her make the tea with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered to him, and what he observed was that she moved through her kitchen with the ease of someone who was genuinely comfortable in her own life, not performing comfort, actually comfortable. There was a difference, and he had spent enough years trying to perform what he could not feel, to recognize it from the outside. The conversation had surprised him. He had expected the careful, managed quality that people applied to conversations with him when they were working towards something they weren't sure they were allowed to ask. Instead, she had moved through the silence without discomfort, and arrived, eventually, at the place where he said the true thing about carrying things in. The words had come out at a slightly higher resolution than he had planned. What came out was not the controlled version he had prepared. It was the honest version, slightly ahead of schedule. She had received it without moving toward it or away from it. She had simply let it sit in the room between them, and the sitting of it there was its own kind of response, one that said the thing was real, and that she knew it was real, and that she was not going to do anything to make it more manageable. He had not known, until that moment in her kitchen, that this was something he had been wanting from a conversation for a very long time, without having a name for it. He walked home in the rain thinking about the specific quality of being heard. Not understood. Understanding was a different thing, requiring interpretation and inference and the possibility of error. Being heard was more basic and more rare. He had been heard, in her kitchen, exactly as what he was, and the experience of it was disorienting in the specific way of things that are new. Like a note you have never heard before in a piece of music you thought you knew completely. He had one clear memory from the first relationship, from the period just before Clara left, that he returned to occasionally when he was trying to understand what had gone wrong. It was an evening at a restaurant, unremarkable in every external detail, during which he had said something he thought was honest, and she had gone quiet, in the way she went quiet, when she was deciding how to say something difficult. He had waited. She had said, "I sometimes feel like there are 2 of you, and I only ever get to be with one of them." He had said he understood what she meant. He had not, at the time, fully understood what she meant. He understood it now. The 2 of him had been the presented version and the actual version, and Clara had been living with the presented version while sensing the actual version through the wall. Nadia had walked straight past the presented version on the first day and had been looking at the actual version ever since, and what she found there had not produced in her the expression that it had produced in Clara. That particular expression that said, "I am not sure I have the resources for this," that I had not known I was being asked for resources of this kind. What he had heard from Nadia, over the tea and the conversations and the Thursdays, was nothing about resources. He had not, as far as he could tell, been perceived as a demand. He had simply been perceived as himself, which was such a specific and unusual thing that he had not, even now, fully believed it was what it was. But the evidence continued to accumulate, and Marcus was a man who trusted evidence more than he trusted the protective stories he told himself, and the evidence said, "She sees you, and she is choosing to stay, and this is not a misunderstanding." He put on his running shoes. He opened the door. He went to the path. He slept. He woke early. He made coffee. He went to the river path and ran it, in the gray morning light, and for the first time in a long time, he did not run to outpace the wolf. He ran because the morning was there, and the path was there, and he was there, and that was, for the moment, enough. He made the decision on a Saturday morning, 10 days after the first tee, while he was running, and the decision arrived the way his most significant decisions arrived, not gradually, not after deliberation, but suddenly and completely. The way a view opens up when you crest a hill. He was running fast on the river path, and the water was gray, and the air was cold, and the decision was simply there. When he stopped looking for it, he would tell her. Not because he believed it would go well. He had become, over the years, a man who had a reasonably accurate sense of the range of probable outcomes in most situations, and he did not think the probable outcome here was a good one. He thought the most probable outcome was that she would listen carefully, as she listened to everything, and then she would take a step back, not immediately, not unkindly, but in the measured way of a person who has received complete information and is adjusting their position accordingly. He thought this was what would happen. He had seen it happen enough times to assign it a high probability. But he had decided that she deserved the full picture. This was not a strategic decision, and it was not an act of self-protection. It was a principled one, in the specific way that Marcus's decisions were principled. He believed in honest accounting. He believed that if you were going to spend time with someone, they had a right to know what they were spending time with. He had given Nadia a partial version of himself so far, the contained version, the professional version, the version that had shared a small piece but held back the weight of the whole. She deserved the complete version. What she did with it was her decision to make. He asked her, on Thursday, whether he could come over Sunday. She said yes, come for the afternoon. She said there was something she wanted to say too, which made him curious, but he did not ask what it was. He arrived at 3 o'clock. The Sunday was clear and cold, in the specific way of the beginning of winter, with the kind of light that is bright but not warm. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table as they had before, the same positions, and the kitchen was the same warm small space, with the same books, and the same thriving plant, and the same refrigerator note, which still said, "Call back Iris," though she had told him Iris was her cousin, and the note had been there since the summer. She said, "You go first." He looked at her across the table. He said, "How did you know I had something to say?" She said, "You asked to come over Sunday afternoon. You don't do that unless there's something specific." He accepted this. It was accurate. He was not someone who called for company without a reason. He began. He told her about his father, the full version, not the spare summary he had offered before. He told her about the silences, the specific texture of them, the way a silence that belongs to grief is different from a silence that belongs to composure. He told her about being 9 years old on an ordinary morning, and the particular way that kind of loss shapes a child's understanding of how reliable the world is, whether the people in it can be trusted to remain, whether love is something you build on or something you brace against. He told her about the years of learning to carry things without showing the weight of them, and how completely he had learned this lesson, and how the lesson had served him in some ways and cost him in others. He told her about Clara, and what Clara had said when she left, and about Liam, and what Liam had said, and about the way each exit had confirmed something he had been trying to decide was not true. He told her about the pattern he had recognized, the grace period, and the adjustment, and the managed distance, and the way he had braced for this pattern after Finn's gathering, without having decided to brace. Then he told her about the wolf. He used that word. He explained it carefully, not as something that needed defending, not as something he was ashamed of, but as something that was real, and that he wanted her to understand fully, before she made any decisions about how she wanted to proceed. He described it from the outside, from what people had told him over the years, and then from the inside, which he had never described to anyone before. From the inside, he said, it felt like a pressure that began somewhere below the sternum and built upward, like something rising toward the surface that did not have anywhere else to go and was not interested in the timing of its arrival. It was not controllable in the way of an ordinary feeling. It was older than that. It had its own schedule. He told her all of this. She listened from the beginning to the end, without interrupting, without changing her expression in the ways people sometimes change their expression as a way of signaling that they were keeping up, without performing comprehension, or sympathy, or concern. She simply listened with her complete, undivided attention, and her eyes were steady on him, and she did not look away. When he finished, there was a silence. He let it be. He was practiced at silence. Then she said, "I know." He said, "You've seen a piece of it." She said, "I've seen enough of it to know it's real, and to know it belongs to something a long time old, and to know it's not the whole of you." She paused, "And I'm still sitting here." He looked at her. He said, "I know. I could see that." She said, "So what does that tell you?" He considered the question seriously, which was the only way he knew how to consider questions. Then he said, "It tells me you're either not frightened by it, or you're staying despite being frightened, or you don't yet understand the full weight of it." He held her eyes. "I'm not sure which." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does it change anything, which one it is?" He thought about that. "Not right now," he said. "No." She nodded. Then she said, "My turn." And she told him something he had not expected. She told him about her own history, the parts she did not put in the front window, the parts she had carried her own way. She told him about her father, who had been a warm and present man until he wasn't, who had changed in a way she could not predict, and still not entirely understand, and what it had been like to watch someone transform out of their own warm self. She told him about a relationship she had left rather than been left by, a relationship where she had given everything she had, and found, finally, that giving everything is not always enough if what the other person needs is something you don't have to give. She told him about the way she sometimes went very quiet, very far inside herself, in a way that had cost her before because the people around her mistook it for distance when it was actually its opposite. It was where she went when she was closest to something true. He listened to all of it in the same way she had listened to him, completely, without hurry, without performing his response. When she was done, he said, "I didn't know any of that." She said, "Nobody does, except Cole, and now you." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Why me?" She said, "Because you told me yours first, and because I thought you'd understand the difference between distance and depth." He had no immediate response to that, which was rare for him. He held it instead, the way she had told him she held things, in the quiet place where things were most themselves. She refilled their coffee cups. They sat there for a while longer, in the changed atmosphere of a kitchen that now contained both of them more completely than it had an hour before. She asked him things, and he answered them, and he asked her things, and she answered them. And the afternoon went past its first hour, and into its second, and neither of them moved toward the door. At some point she told him about the first time she had run the river path, which had been 3 Saturdays ago, the same morning he had run it, he realized, though at a different hour. She said she had thought about him during it, which she said plainly, without making it more than it was or less than it was. He said, "What did you think?" She said, "I thought I hadn't figured out your frequency yet." He said, "Have you now?" She looked at him across the table, with the direct, unmanaged look he had come to recognize as entirely her own, the look that held exactly what it held and nothing that it didn't. She said, "Getting closer." He had not expected her to tell him something back. He had prepared himself, on the walk over and in the days before it, for the possibility that the telling would produce a withdrawal, the polite but definitive withdrawal of a person who has received more than they bargained for and is now recalibrating the appropriate level of closeness. He had not imagined the possibility that she would simply begin, in the same tone she had just been listening in, to tell him something of her own. What she told him was real. He knew real things when he heard them, had developed, over years of distinguishing between the versions of things people offered in conversation and the actual things beneath those versions, a reliable sense of when he was in the presence of the actual thing. What she told him about her father, and about the relationship she had left, and about the drawer where she put things she was not yet ready to look at, was real, in exactly this way. Not dramatized, not performed, just said. In the same direct register she said everything, as if the telling were simply the next true thing. He had been a genuinely careful listener for his entire adult life, more from necessity than choice. Careful listening was one of the skills his childhood had produced in him, the ability to hear what was said, and what was not said, and what was being communicated in the gap between those two things. He listened to Nadia with this skill fully deployed, and what he heard was a person who was not offering him something in exchange for what he had offered. Not trading vulnerability for vulnerability in the calculated way people sometimes did. She was simply telling him a true thing because the moment called for it, because she was someone who responded to honesty with honesty, and this was the most natural form of response available to her. He said, when she finished, that he hadn't known any of it. She said she knew he hadn't, and that this was true of almost everyone, and that she wanted him to have it because she thought he would understand it. The specific way she said that, the precision of it, the clarity of what she was giving and why, stayed with him in the way that precise and honest things stayed. They talked for another hour. Not about those things. Those things had been said and received and were complete in themselves. They talked about other things, the way people talk when they have just said something significant and need a little time for the ground to settle before they continue. He told her about a book he had read recently that had surprised him. She told him about something Cole had said the previous week. These were small things, ordinary things, and the ordinary quality of them was itself a kind of gift. The gift of two people who have said true things to each other and discovered that the ordinary can still exist afterward, that truth does not require everything else to stop. He added something else to his telling that Sunday, something he had been circling around without going directly toward. He told her about hope, about the specific way he had learned to manage it, not by abandoning it, but by keeping it at a distance, treating it as a quantity to be carefully rationed rather than a resource that replenished itself. He had learned to hope at a controlled volume, because hope at full volume had been, in his experience, the thing that made the subsequent withdrawals most costly. When you hoped fully, when you let yourself be fully open to the possibility of something, the gap between that openness and the thing that actually arrived was proportional. He had reduced the gap by reducing the openness. She listened to this and was quiet for a moment. In the specific way she was quiet when she was locating the right thing to say, rather than the convenient thing. Then she said, "That sounds like a lot of work." He said it was. She said, "Does it work?" He said, "Partially." She said, "What does the other part feel like?" He thought about it. He said, "Like the thing you were protecting yourself from has happened anyway, just more slowly." She nodded. She said, "Yeah." Just that word, just that short affirmation, and in it was the whole acknowledgement, that she understood, not because she could imagine it, but because something of the same structure lived in her too, her drawer, her own managed distances. That they were, in this way, more similar than he had initially assumed, and that this similarity was not the similarity of shared damage, but of shared intelligence about the nature of things that are difficult to carry. He felt, in that moment, the quality that he had come to associate most strongly with Nadia's company, the sense of being met, not accommodated, not handled, met, the specific sensation of two people who have both turned toward the same thing and looked at it honestly, and found themselves, to their mutual surprise, looking at it from nearly the same angle. He walked home in the early dark of a winter Sunday, and the streets were quiet, and the air was cold, and he was thinking about nothing he could have summarized in a sentence. He was simply in the world, fully in it, in the way you are in the world, after an afternoon that has been real all the way through. Not performed, not managed, real. He had told a person everything, and the person had stayed in the room, and then had told him everything back. He had never been on the receiving end of that exchange before. He had not known what it would feel like, and what it felt like was this, like a window in a closed room being opened. Not the whole wall, just the window. Just enough that the air inside and the air outside were, for the first time in a long time, the same. He went home. He cooked. He ate at his table and read a book, actually read it this time, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, and lay in the dark for only a short while before sleeping. The wolf was quiet that night, not gone, quiet. And in the specific silence of the wolf being quiet, Marcus could hear something underneath it that he had not heard clearly in a long time. Something that had been there always, but that the wolf's noise had covered. Something that sounded, improbably and without any guarantee, like the beginning of something new. The relationship between Marcus and Nadia did not announce itself. It did not step into the light and declare its intentions. It grew the way things grow, when they are not being managed or arranged or hurried, quietly, in the direction of its own nature, according to a schedule that belonged to itself. They began spending Wednesdays together, and then some Sundays, and then the occasional weekday evening when one of them was nearby, and neither of them had a reason to go directly home. These were not scheduled. They arrived the way things arrive between two people who have found the other's company genuinely preferable to the available alternatives, through the natural accumulation of preference, through the quiet admission that here was better than there. Marcus learned the specifics of her daily rhythms. She was slower in the mornings than she appeared at work, arrived already assembled, already professional, but he knew now that the assembly had required coffee and at least 30 minutes of quiet before the front door. She read on lunch breaks and was not to be interrupted during the last chapter of anything. She cooked badly but without embarrassment about it, which was something he had not expected, and which made him offer to cook when they ate together. And she accepted this, not as service but as collaboration, and came to his kitchen and sat on the counter while he cooked and talked about things that were unrelated to cooking, which was the best possible version of that arrangement. She learned his rhythms in the way she learned everything, quietly, through observation, without announcing what she had learned, until the moment when using the knowledge made more sense than withholding it. She learned that Monday evenings were the worst of the week for him, for reasons neither of them ever fully articulated, but that had to do with the specific weight of fresh beginnings arriving on top of unfinished things from the week before. She learned that he processed difficulties better in motion than in stillness, and that if something had happened, a walk was more useful than sitting in a room. She learned that he sometimes went quiet, not because he was closing off, but because he was going deep into something, and that this was different from the closing off quiet, and that the right response to the going deep quiet was simply to let it be. She did not make a project of this knowledge. She did not use it to demonstrate her understanding or to produce the performance of someone who pays attention. She simply used it, naturally and without commentary, the way you use the knowledge of any space you have learned to move through comfortably. The difficult days came, because of course they came. Marcus had been clear about this, had said it plainly at the beginning, and the truth of it did not diminish, because the good days were genuinely good. There were days when the wolf was at the surface before he was fully awake, when the weight of it pressed through the structure of the morning and made ordinary things require more than they should have. On those days he was quieter, more internal, moving through the world with his attention turned further inward than usual. The first time one of those days happened while they were together, it was a Thursday evening. He had had a meeting that afternoon, in which a decision he had carefully prepared and clearly argued was overruled, on grounds that had nothing to do with the quality of the argument, and everything to do with politics that existed above his position. He had said nothing in the meeting beyond what was professionally necessary. He had returned to his desk and worked through the remaining 2 hours of the day without speaking unless spoken to. By the time he left the office, the wolf was not fully at the surface, but it was close, pressing upward, making its presence felt. Nadia was at his apartment when he arrived. She had a key and used it without ceremony, which had stopped feeling unusual after the first few times. She was sitting on his couch reading, and she looked up when he came in, and she saw immediately. He knew she saw immediately, because she had the specific perceptiveness of a person who has paid consistent attention, that the day had been the kind of day it had been. She did not say anything for a moment. She said, "Do you want to eat first or walk first?" He said, "Walk." They walked for 45 minutes through the city streets in the cold evening. He did not tell her what had happened in the meeting, not yet. She did not ask. They walked at the pace he needed, which was slightly faster than comfortable, and they did not speak very much, and the city went past them, and the air was cold, and the movement was the thing he needed it to be, a way to give the wolf's energy somewhere to go that wasn't inward. On the walk back he told her about the meeting. He told it plainly, with the specific detail that made it real, rather than a vague complaint, and she listened, and she said what she thought, which was informed and honest, and did not arrive packaged in the language of consolation. She did not tell him it would work out, or that the decision might be reconsidered, or that these things had a way of resolving themselves. She said it sounded genuinely difficult and badly handled, and she said it in the tone of a person who agrees with your assessment because your assessment is correct, which was more useful than any comfort. By the time they got back to his building, the wolf had settled. Not gone. Settled, lower and quieter, back to its usual depth. They made dinner together in his kitchen. He cooked. She stood at the counter and talked about something that had happened at Cole's that weekend, something moderately funny, involving Cole's opinion about a film they had both seen. Marcus listened and cooked, and the wolf stayed settled, and the kitchen was warm, and it occurred to him, as it sometimes did in these moments, that the thing he had believed was the best that could be arranged, the careful distance, the managed accommodation, was not the best. It was simply what he had been given before this. There was an evening, several weeks later, when she arrived at his apartment after a difficult day of her own. A day she described in her particular way, which was precisely and without drama, giving only the facts, and letting the facts carry the weight. He listened. He did not offer the reframe or the silver lining. He said, when she had finished, that it sounded like a hard day fairly handled, and she looked at him with a brief, unmistakable expression of relief, the specific relief of a person who has been heard rather than consoled. They sat on his couch for the rest of the evening and watched something inconsequential on the television, the kind of thing neither of them would have remembered the next week, and the evening was unremarkable in every measurable sense, and entirely remarkable in the only sense that mattered. He began to notice something he had not anticipated and could not immediately explain. The wolf was arriving less frequently, not less intensely when it arrived. The intensity was unchanged. The old weight was still the old weight. Nothing about its nature had been altered, but the intervals between its arrivals were longer. He was not spending as many mornings with the weight pressing through from the beginning, not as many evenings working to outrun it. It was as if something in the environment had changed. He thought about this carefully, the way he thought about everything, turning it over until he understood it properly. And what he arrived at, through the careful examination, was this: that part of what had fed the wolf, part of what had made it hungrier and more frequent, was the specific loneliness of being the thing that drove people away. When the wolf arrived, people left, and when people left, the wolf was, in a sense, confirmed. Its arrival produced the evidence of its own reason for arriving, a closed system, self-sustaining and exhausting, that had been running for most of Marcus's adult life. Nadia had not fixed the system. She had simply refused to participate in it. She had declined the role that the system required, which was the role of person who leaves, and in declining it, had disrupted the pattern that had given the wolf its particular character. The wolf was still there. It was still old and heavy, and beyond his complete control. But it was no longer working in isolation. And working in isolation had been, apparently, the thing that made it what it most often was. He told her this one evening over dinner in the 4th month. He said he wanted her to know that things were different from how they had been. She looked at him. She asked different how. He said, there's more room. Not because anything is fixed. I don't mean that. I mean the weight is the same, but it fits differently. Like a coat that used to pull at the shoulders. He paused. That's not a great metaphor. She said she thought it was a fine metaphor. He said, you're the reason for the difference. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Her expression was not the expression of someone receiving a compliment. It was the expression of someone receiving information they already had, but that meant something to hear confirmed. She said, I'm glad. He said, I wanted to say it because it seemed right to say it, not to put something on you, just to tell you what's true. She said, I know the difference. She did. That was the particular and extraordinary thing. She knew the difference between being credited with someone's improvement and being told a true thing about the effect she had had. She knew the difference the way she knew most things, through the specific attention she had been paying, quietly and consistently, since the beginning. The evening continued. They ate and they talked about other things, and at some point, she laughed at something, and the sound of it reached him the way it always did, easily, without effort, in the specific frequency of real laughter, rather than performed laughter, which are two entirely different sounds, and one of the more reliable ways of knowing whether the space between you and another person is genuine. He drove her home that night, because the weather had turned, and she said goodnight at her door, and he drove back through the empty city streets, thinking about almost nothing at all, which was a rare and valuable condition for Marcus, who was usually thinking about several things at once. He parked. He went upstairs. He made tea, and stood at the window, and looked at the city street below, the wet pavement, and the streetlights, and the occasional passing car. He was not happy in the simple, uncomplicated sense of the word. He had too much history for simple happiness, too much that had shaped him into someone for whom simplicity was not the natural register. But he was something that occupied the same general territory as contentment, or perhaps just the quiet recognition that things were, right now, in this specific season, better than they had been. Not fixed, not resolved, better. The wolf was settled in its place. She had a word for what she was doing with Marcus, which she had never said to him, and which she used only in the privacy of her own thinking. She called it accompanying, not helping, not supporting, not any of the verbs that implied she was doing something to or for him, accompanying, moving through the same terrain at the same pace, and being present for whatever the terrain contained, without deciding in advance what the appropriate response to any of it was. She had done this before, in a small number of other relationships, because it was simply her nature, the way she had always instinctively understood, that the most honest form of care was presence rather than solution. But she had never done it with someone whose terrain was as specific and as old and as genuinely difficult as Marcus's, and she was learning things about it that she had not known she would learn. She was learning, for instance, that being present in someone else's difficult terrain was not the same as taking on the difficulty yourself. She had worried about this in the early weeks, had wondered whether sustained proximity to Marcus's weight would transfer some of it to her, whether she would begin to carry something she had not signed up to carry. What she found instead was the opposite. What she found was that genuine presence, the kind that did not have an agenda, that did not try to change what it encountered, that simply witnessed and stayed, was not costly in the way that performed support was costly. Performed support, the kind she had occasionally offered in her life when she was not sure how to offer the real thing, required energy in the way of maintenance, because you were constantly monitoring the performance and adjusting it and making sure it looked like what it was supposed to look like. Real presence was simpler. You only had to be there. This simplicity was something she could not have explained to most people. Most people would have heard a description of what she was doing with Marcus, sitting in his apartment on bad evenings, running beside him in the cold, saying nothing when nothing was what was needed, and would have heard it as a description of endurance, of someone tolerating difficulty for the sake of someone they cared about. They would not have heard it as what it was, which was the specific relief of doing something that felt true. Most of what Nadia had done in her adult life had felt true. But this felt true in a deeper register than usual, which was information she did not ignore. She told Cole some of this, over one of their Wednesday dinners. In the partial and careful way she told Cole things that were still forming. Cole listened and said, "Does he know what you're doing?" She thought about it. She said, "He's beginning to understand it." Cole said, "That's probably the right pace." She agreed. She had noticed, in those months, that Marcus's sense of humor was one of the things that revealed him most completely, more than the serious conversations, which he was good at and careful in, more than the difficult moments, which he managed with the specific kind of grit she had come to recognize as characteristic. His humor was dry and quiet and appeared without announcement, and it was often aimed at himself, which told her something about the relationship between his self-awareness and his self-seriousness. He knew exactly what he was. He found certain aspects of it, privately and without theatrics, genuinely funny. She found this not just endearing but clarifying. A person who can find themselves funny has a certain kind of freedom from themselves that is rarer than it sounds. She told Cole this in one of their Wednesday dinners, and Cole said, "Are you going to tell him that?" She said she probably would eventually. Cole said that seemed right. Marcus stood at the window and let it be there. Let it be the old and heavy thing it was, and did not fight it, and did not manage it, and did not pretend it wasn't there. He only stood at the window and looked at the city, and let the two things, the wolf and the better thing, coexist in the same night, which they could, now, which they had learned to, because someone had shown both of them that coexistence was possible. The night it broke open was not a night he had predicted, and Marcus was someone who predicted things well. He had developed over his adult life a reasonably accurate early warning system for the conditions that made the wolf more likely to arrive at full force, the accumulation of fatigue, the particular kind of professional frustration that left no productive outlet, the dates in the calendar that carried their own weight, regardless of what was happening around them. He had learned to recognize these conditions and respond to them with the practical management strategies that had served him across the years. The longer run, the focused cooking, the call to Ben or Sophie, the deliberate and early choice to acknowledge that something was pressing and to do something about it before it arrived on its own terms. He had been managing well, better than well. The previous months had been, in the honest accounting he applied to everything, genuinely good. The work was going well. His father had called twice, which was more than usual, and the calls had been brief but warmer than they had been before. Nadia was present in his life in the specific, grounding way she had become present, and the wolf, while never absent, had been residing at a manageable depth. He had no warning of what was coming. He could not have had warning, because it came from a direction he had not been watching. It was a Wednesday. He had worked a full day and come home and made dinner and was washing the dishes afterward, a task he did by hand rather than using the dishwasher, because it required the specific kind of ordinary physical attention that often served him well in the evenings, when his phone lit up with an email notification. The sender was a name he recognized after a moment: Iris, the older woman who had lived next door to them when he was growing up. She sent him messages a few times a year, small updates, affectionate and brief, the kind of correspondence that maintained a connection without placing demands on it. This message was different from the others. He saw this before he had fully read it. In the way you see something is different when you know someone's writing well enough to feel the change in temperature before you have parsed the content. She wrote that she thought he should know something, that she had been going back and forth about whether to tell him, and had finally decided that knowing was better than not knowing, even if the timing was not ideal. His father had been in the hospital 3 weeks ago. A cardiac event, she said, and she wrote the words, "not serious," and "routine recovery," in a way that suggested she was aware of how inadequate those words were, and was using them anyway, because they were the closest available. He was home now. He was fine, as much as Iris could tell, but she thought Marcus should know. Marcus read the email standing at the kitchen sink with the water still running over his hands. He read it twice. He turned off the tap. 3 weeks ago. His father had been in a hospital 3 weeks ago, and Marcus had not known, had not been told, had spent those 3 weeks in complete ignorance of the fact that the person who was, despite everything, the first person he had ever loved, had been in a building full of medical equipment for reasons that had to do with his heart. He had woken on those mornings and run the river path and eaten his meals and worked his days and been present in his life with no awareness whatsoever that something serious was happening to his father, because his father had not told him, and apparently no one else had told him either, and the only reason he was finding out now was because an elderly neighbor had made a private decision after 3 weeks of deliberation. He stood in the kitchen and let the information arrive completely. This was the thing about his father that he had never fully resolved, the thing that existed at the bottom of all the other things, below the silences and the distance and the managed relationship they had developed over the years. His father was the person who had first demonstrated to Marcus what love looked like, and the shape that demonstration had taken was, love is something you carry privately, something you do not share, something that sits in you alone until it has nowhere else to go. His father had loved Marcus in the only way he knew, which was from inside a container that had no opening, and Marcus had learned love from this demonstration, and he had spent his adult life trying to find a way to learn something different without having a different example to learn from. He called his father. The phone rang 8 times. He listened to the voicemail message, his father's voice, short and exact, the same voice as always, and he held the phone against his ear through the tone and found that he had nothing to say. Not because he had nothing to feel, because he had too much to feel, and none of it had arrived in a form that language could carry, and so he ended the call without leaving a message, and stood in the kitchen, and the wolf arrived. The full version, the oldest version, not the manageable press of a difficult day, not the ordinary weight of ordinary difficulty, but the thing that lived below all of that, the thing that had been built from 9 years old, and his father's silence, and his mother's leaving, and 2 relationships that had ended with some variation of "you are too much," and the years of proving to himself that he could carry everything alone. It rose from wherever it lived when it was quiet, and it arrived at the surface, and it was enormous and entirely present. He sat down on the kitchen floor, because the floor was there, and it was the right height for what he was feeling, which was lower than everything else. He called Nadia. He did not plan to. His hand was already moving, and then the phone was ringing, and then she answered, and he said her name, and then he said, "I need," and the sentence had no ending, because the ending was too large to locate. She said, "I'm coming." She did not ask what had happened. She did not ask if he was sure, or offer to talk on the phone instead, or negotiate the terms of her arrival. She said she was coming, and she ended the call, and Marcus sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the lower cabinet, and looked at the kitchen tiles and waited. She arrived in 12 minutes. She let herself in. He heard her come through the hallway and move through the apartment, heard her register the kitchen light, the discarded dish towel, the state of things, and then she was standing in the doorway looking at him on the floor. She did not make a sound of alarm. She did not look at him with the frightened expression of someone encountering something they don't know how to manage. She looked at him with the steady, complete attention she gave to everything that mattered. And then she walked across the kitchen and sat down on the floor across from him, with her back against the opposite cabinet, and she was there. He told her all of it, the email, the 3 weeks, the 8 rings, the voicemail, the phone call that had no words. He told her about his father's heart and what it meant to him, and what it said about the specific kind of man his father was, to have been in a hospital and not told his son, to have needed something and chosen to need it alone. He told her about the way that kind of modeling works, how a child absorbs what they see and carries it forward, how he had been his father's student in all the ways that mattered and all the ways that had cost him, and how he had tried for 34 years to find the lesson he had been given a different shape and had only partially succeeded. He told her about being 9 years old on an ordinary morning, which he had not told anyone in the full version, which he had given her only as a fact before and not as an experience. He told her what it had felt like from the inside, the specific quality of a morning when the world reconfigures itself around an absence, when you are still using the maps of the world that included the person who is no longer in it, and you have to learn, day by day, how to revise the maps. He told her about the particular loneliness of a child who has learned not to ask for help, because asking for help is not something the people around him do. He was not crying. This was not that kind of breaking open. It was something harder and quieter than tears, the kind of thing that happens when something has been contained for a very long time, and the container finally reaches its limit, not with drama but with a slow, complete release. She listened to all of it without speaking. She did not touch him, which was exactly right, because touch in that moment would have been an interruption of something that needed to complete itself. She sat across from him on the cold kitchen floor, and she breathed the same air, and she was entirely, completely present, and she did not move. The talking stopped eventually. He did not know exactly when. He found himself sitting in silence, looking at the tiles, and the wolf was still there, but it had changed in its quality. Usually when the wolf arrived in full force, it built to a peak and then retreated, withdrew back into itself, left Marcus in the aftermath of it, exhausted and alone in the specific way of someone who has just spent a great deal of energy managing something alone. But this time it had not retreated. It had simply stilled. He became aware, at some point, that the kitchen was dark. Neither of them had moved to turn on a light. He looked up. He looked at Nadia across the small dark kitchen, sitting with her knees drawn up and her hands around them, and her face turned toward him with the same steady attention, even here, even in the dark. And the wolf, large and old and shaped by everything that had made it, looked at her, and was still. Not gone. Not tamed. Not fixed or resolved or cured of anything. Simply still, in the way something becomes still, when it has finally understood that it is not alone. Nadia said, after a while, "Do you want some water?" He said yes. She got up and filled 2 glasses from the tap in the dark, and the sound of the water was the most ordinary sound in the world, and she sat back down on the floor and handed him a glass, and he drank it, and they sat there a while longer while the city outside went about its city business, in complete indifference to what was happening on this particular kitchen floor. What he had said to her on the phone was not a complete sentence, and this was significant to him later. He had said her name, and then he had said, "I need," and he had not been able to find the end of the sentence, because the end of the sentence was everything. He needed all of it, the floor and the company, and someone who knew the full picture, and would not require him to explain anything from the beginning. That was what he had tried to say with those 2 words and their trailing silence, and she had heard it completely, had understood what the incomplete sentence contained, and had said she was coming without requiring any more. He had sat on the floor and waited, and the wolf sat with him, and the kitchen was the kitchen that had been witness to some of the best evenings of the past months, the evenings of easy dinners and easy conversation, and it was strange to be on its floor now, with the weight at full force. Strange, and also right in the way that things are right when they happen, in the exact place they need to happen. He had found the floor of this kitchen before, in his own apartment, with the same wolf and the same collapse of managed strength. He was finding it again here, in her kitchen, which was different and the same. When she came through the door and walked to the kitchen and sat down across from him, the first thing he noticed was that she did not say his name in the particular tone that people use when they encounter someone in distress and are startled by the degree of it. She did not say his name at all. She walked across the kitchen, and she sat down on the floor, and she was there, and and the quality of her being there was the same quality it had always been. The same full, unmanaged presence. The same attentiveness without agenda. Nothing in the emergency had changed the way she offered her company. She had always sat with him the same way. The worst version of the evening did not require a different version of her. He had told her everything. He could not have said afterward whether it had taken 10 minutes or an hour, because time on the kitchen floor had the specific quality of time outside the ordinary. Slow in some ways and complete in others, as if the duration were less important than what was contained. He had told her about the email and the 3 weeks and the 8 rings and the voicemail, and all of the things those facts connected to, and she had sat across from him and listened, and the room had slowly filled with what he was saying, and there had been, at some point, a shift. The moment when the telling was complete, when everything had been said that could be said, and what remained was only the silence of having said it. In that silence, which was different from every other silence he had sat in during the months of knowing her, something settled in him that he had not known was unsettled, not resolved, settled, the way things settle when they have been in motion for too long, and are finally, simply, allowed to be still. He became aware, gradually, that the wolf was not pressing anymore, not retreated, not withdrawn back to wherever it lived when it wasn't needed. Still there, fully present, but still, as if it had been carrying something, and the carrying was no longer necessary. As if the thing it had been trying to get out of him had gotten out, finally, not through pressure but through the completely different mechanism of being received. She had said nothing when she sat down on the floor across from him. This had been a choice, though not a calculated one. She had stood in the doorway and looked at him and understood, from the specific quality of what she saw, that words were not what this moment needed, that any word, even a gentle one, would have been the wrong form of entry into what was happening. Words required a response. They created a transaction, they moved toward something. What this moment needed was the thing that words were the opposite of. Presence without destination, without requirement, without the implicit claim that what was happening needed to move anywhere at all. She had sat down and been still, and let him be in what he was in, and when he was ready to speak he had spoken, and she had received it the same way she always received the things he told her. Completely, with the full attention she gave to things that were real, and that mattered to her. She had not fixed it. She could not have fixed it. The loss that was in that kitchen was not something that could be fixed, had not been something that could be fixed for 25 years, but it could be sat with. And that, she had discovered in the months of knowing him, was sometimes more than enough. He leaned his head back against the cabinet, eventually, and closed his eyes, and the wolf sat beside him, and the floor was cold, and the glass was empty, and Nadia was there, and that was the state of things for a long time, without either of them needing to change it. There is a morning that comes after the floor. It is not a morning with anything special in it, no extraordinary light, no clarifying revelation, no sudden sense that things have been rearranged into a better order. It is simply a morning, ordinary in every external particular, with the same city sounds and the same gray light, and the same coffee to be made. But the person in it is different from the person they were the evening before, not because they have changed in any dramatic sense, but because something has passed through them completely, and after something passes through you completely, you are not quite the same shape you were before. Marcus woke on the Thursday after the kitchen floor, and lay still for a moment. Not because he was tired, he had slept, surprisingly and completely, for the first time in weeks, in a sleep that did not have the shallow, watchful quality of his usual nights. He lay still, because the room felt different, in a way he was trying to understand, before he moved through it. Nadia had stayed. Not because either of them had arranged it, but because it had been very late when they finally moved from the kitchen floor to more reasonable positions. His couch, her reading, him eventually going to bed, and she had fallen asleep reading, with the specific completeness of a person who had used a lot of themselves that evening, and had run out of reserves. He had found her asleep when he came to tell her she could take the bed, and he had looked at her for a moment, and got a blanket from the cupboard, and gone to bed and slept. In the morning she was in the kitchen before him, which he heard before he saw. He walked out to find her standing at the counter with 2 mugs, and the easy, unself-conscious posture of a person who was comfortable in a space. Her hair was loose in the way it never was at work, and she was looking out the window at the gray morning. She handed him a mug when he appeared in the doorway. She asked if he had slept. He said yes. She said good. They stood at the counter and drank their coffee and looked out the window and did not say anything for a while. And the silence between them was the silence they had been building for months, not empty, not waiting for anything, but full of everything that did not require saying out loud, because it was already understood. He called his father at 9. He had decided this in the night, in the final moments before sleep, not as a decision requiring deliberation, but as simply the next right thing. The phone rang 4 times. His father answered. The conversation was careful and short, in the way their conversations had always been careful and short. His father said he hadn't wanted to worry him. Marcus said he understood, and then said, "I want you to call me if something happens, whatever it is, even if you think it's under control. I want to know." His father was quiet for a moment, then he said, "All right," 2 words, no elaboration, but spoken in a tone that Marcus recognized, after a lifetime of reading his father's tones, as genuine. He told Nadia about it when she came over that evening. He told it plainly, the way he told things now, completely and without managing the telling. She listened and said, "How does it feel?" He said it felt like something had moved. Not dramatically, but something. She said that counted. She said it simply, without ceremony, and he received it the same way, simply, without ceremony. He was learning this, that the things that mattered most between them were said and received in exactly this register. Not amplified, not dramatized, just said and received, and that was enough. He was learning other things too, in those weeks. He was learning what it meant to be known without the knowledge being used against you, which was a thing he had not previously had enough experience of to fully understand. He had known, in theory, that being known fully by another person was possible. He had known it the way you know about places you have read about but never visited, as a fact about the world, real but not yet real to him. Nadia knew him now. She knew the wolf by name, and by nature, and by the specific conditions under which it arrived. She knew about his father and his mother, and the 9-year-old child who had built a container around everything he felt, because there was no one else to hold it. She knew about Clara and Liam, and the pattern of withdrawals. She knew about the running, and the cooking, and the books, and the particular quality of his Monday evenings. She knew all of this, and she was still here, still arriving with her canvas bag, and her easy manner, and her genuine curiosity about him, that had not diminished as the mystery had resolved, because he had discovered, in her, that curiosity did not require mystery as its fuel. Real curiosity was interested in the known thing as much as the unknown one, because the known thing revealed new layers the more carefully you looked at it. He was learning the same about her. She was revealing herself in the patient, unhurried way she did everything, not strategically, not performing the revelation, just becoming gradually more present in the fuller sense, the way a room reveals its details as your eyes adjust to the light. He learned that she woke slowly, and needed half an hour before she was ready for the world, and that she found this quality mildly irritating in herself, which he found interesting, because there was nothing mildly irritating about it from the outside. He learned that she was fiercely loyal, in a way she did not announce, but that showed itself in specific moments, in how she talked about Cole, in how she handled a conflict that arose at the office. He learned that she had her own version of the wolf, smaller and quieter, and differently shaped, but real. She called it the drawer, the place she put things that she was not yet ready to look at, and the drawer sometimes got too full and she needed to deal with the contents, and she preferred to do this alone, which he understood completely, and which they had negotiated, as they negotiated most things, without a formal conversation, through the simpler method of paying attention to what the other person needed. He learned that she could make him laugh. This was not something he had specifically expected or hoped for, and yet it turned out to be one of the things he valued most, the specific ease of someone who understood his particular humor, which was dry and quiet and not performed, and who met it with her own, which was observational and precise, and had the quality of good writing, which was that it saw the thing exactly, and described it exactly, and nothing was wasted. They made each other laugh in the easy, unannounced way of people who are genuinely funny to each other, rather than making an effort to be. He met Cole properly in the 3rd month. Cole took him in over the course of an evening at Nadia's, watching with the careful, affectionate attention of someone who loves a person and wants to understand who they have chosen. At the end of the evening, Cole said something to Marcus that he turned over afterward and kept. "She's good at seeing people clearly." I hope you know that. Marcus had said he was beginning to understand it. Cole had nodded, as if that was exactly the right thing to say, which it was, because the important word was beginning, acknowledging that this was still in progress, that he had not arrived anywhere yet, that the understanding was ongoing. He saw Ben one Sunday, who asked in the direct and unceremonious way of Ben how things were going. Marcus said they were going well. Ben said, "You look different." Marcus asked how. Ben thought about it for a moment, eating his dinner, and then said, "Like you're not carrying it all the way forward from one end." Marcus considered this. He said that sounded about right. Ben nodded and moved to a different subject, which was the correct move, because Ben had never been a man who required more from a statement than the statement contained. He ran the river path on a Saturday morning, and it was cold and clear, the kind of winter morning where everything was very sharp and very clean. And he ran at the same pace he always ran, but the running felt different. Not because anything external had changed, but because the thing he was running with was not the same thing he had always been running with. He was not running away from the wolf. He was not outpacing it. He was running alongside it, the wolf and Marcus, on the same path at the same pace, which was strange and new, and, he decided at some point midway through the path, something close to right. He was not whole. He wanted to be precise about this in his own understanding, because precision was something he valued, and vagueness in one's own self-understanding was a kind of dishonesty. He was not fixed or repaired, or arrived at any destination. He was the same man he had been, shaped by the same history, carrying the same things, with the same wolf that had always been in him. But the relationship between him and those things had changed. Specifically, the aloneness of it had changed. He was no longer the only one who knew the full picture. He was no longer holding it entirely by himself. And he was clear on this. He had thought about it enough to be clear. The difference between possible and impossible, not in terms of the weight itself, in terms of how long you could carry it. He thought about Liam's sentence. "You're waiting for something." He held it up in the light of everything that had happened since, and turned it over. Liam had been right. He had been waiting, for a very long time, and the wait had sometimes looked so long, and so probably futile, that he had convinced himself he had made peace with the alternative. He had not, fully. That was the honest truth. He had not fully made peace with a life carried entirely alone. He had learned to function in it. He had learned to find what was good in it. But he had not, in the deepest and most honest place in himself, fully made peace with it. He did not have to, now, and the specific quality of not having to, the specific texture of that relief, after so many years of the alternative, was something he did not yet have the language to describe, and did not need to describe. He only needed to live in it, to show up for it, to do what Nadia had done for him, which was to simply be present in the space, without asking the space to be something it wasn't. He made, in those weeks, several specific discoveries about what it meant to be known completely by a person who had chosen to remain. The first was that being known did not produce the vulnerability he had expected. He had spent a great deal of his adult life operating with a background awareness that if people knew the whole of him, the knowledge would give them something to use. He had not thought about it this way explicitly. He had not been so calculating as to frame it in those terms, but the behavior had been there regardless. The instinct toward withholding, toward offering only the portions of himself that could not be weaponized. Nadia, knowing everything, had not produced a feeling of exposure. It had produced its opposite. He felt, in her company, more himself than he felt anywhere else, more capable of operating from his actual center, rather than from the managed surface he had been maintaining for everyone else. This was unexpected and important, and he spent time examining it to make sure he was not misreading it. The second discovery was that being known created a kind of efficiency in the relationship that he had not experienced before. He did not need to explain the context for things. When he said that a certain kind of day was difficult, she already had the whole picture. The father's silences, the mother's leaving, the wolf and its triggers. And he did not need to lay it out every time as if from the beginning. He only needed to say the simple thing, and she already understood the layers of it. This efficiency was, unexpectedly, one of the things he found most valuable. He had spent his entire adult life being the person who had to hold the context and deliver it before anyone could understand what he was actually saying. With Nadia, the context was already shared. The third discovery was the most difficult to sit with, because it required him to acknowledge something about himself that was not flattering. He discovered that being known, fully, by a person who did not leave, had begun to do something to his relationship with his own history. Not erasing it, not healing it in the neat, conclusive way of therapeutic language, but shifting it. The history that he had carried entirely alone had been, in his aloneness with it, the defining fact of his existence. It had been the thing that explained him to himself, the thing around which everything else in his life was organized. Now that it was shared, now that another person moved alongside him knowing its full shape, it remained what it was, but it was no longer the only thing. The history was still present, still real, still capable of producing the wolf, but it had been joined by something else, and the something else was changing the proportion of things, the specific weight of each element in his life relative to the others. He thought about this, and about what it meant, and about the specific quality of gratitude he felt for it, which was not the gratitude of a person who has been rescued, but of a person who has been given something they did not know they were capable of receiving. Nadia had shown him something about himself that he had not known. She had shown him, through the simple method of being what she was in his presence over many months, that he was capable of receiving things as well as carrying them. He had always been a carrier, a person who held things, who managed things, who moved through the world with full hands and never set anything down. He had not believed himself to be a person who could receive, who could take in something that another person was offering and hold it in the way it was meant to be held, without immediately turning it into something he needed to carry, rather than something he was being given. Nadia gave him things, small things, mostly, the specific quality of her attention, the particular way she laughed, the things she told him about herself that she did not tell many people. She gave these things without conditions and without record-keeping, the way people give things when they are not keeping score. And he had been, at first, uncertain what to do with the receiving. He had turned it into an obligation, initially, into a debt that needed to be paid in kind. She had noticed this, of course, because she noticed everything, and she had said once, in the exact and direct way she said things that needed to be said, "I'm not handing you a bill." He had looked at her. He had said, "I know." She had said, "I don't think you do, quite yet, but you will." She had been right. He was, now, closer to knowing it than not. He was trying to learn that. He was not there yet. But he was learning it. He was the one who nearly destroyed it, and he knew this precisely, and without the comfort of extenuating circumstances, and he did not try to arrange the knowledge into a more flattering shape. It happened in the 5th month, on a Friday in late November that arrived at the end of a week that had been quietly terrible, in the way that certain weeks are terrible, not through any single catastrophic event, but through the sustained accumulation of too many small things going wrong for too many consecutive days, so that by Friday, the reserves that usually replenish themselves overnight had been drawn down to something close to nothing. The week had begun with the project cancellation. He had been working on this project for 3 months. Detailed, thorough work, the kind he was best at, built on a foundation of careful analysis that he had constructed piece by piece over the previous season. On Monday morning, in a 12-minute meeting, the project was cancelled due to a budget realignment that had nothing to do with the quality of the work, and everything to do with decisions made in rooms he did not have access to. The project manager said Marcus's work had been excellent. The project manager said it was unfortunate. The project manager moved to the next agenda item. Marcus returned to his desk and began the task of filing the work in the system in a way that acknowledged its cancellation, which was one of the more quietly crushing forms of administrative labor. Tuesday, his father called. The call was not bad, objectively. His father was well. The recovery was continuing. The neighbor who had been bringing food had apparently been bringing too much food, and his father was now dealing with an abundance of casseroles, which he reported in a tone that was almost wry. But underneath the ordinary content of the call, Marcus could hear what he had always been able to hear in his father's voice, the loneliness, dressed in practical language, wearing its useful camouflage. He heard it, and he felt it, in the specific way you feel things that belong to your history, not as something current and separate, but as something layered into the structure of you. Wednesday and Thursday were professionally unremarkable and personally exhausting, in the specific way of days that take more from you than they give back, and offer nothing you can point to as the reason. By Friday morning, he was operating on reserves that were thinner than he had managed in a long time. He had slept badly for 4 consecutive nights. The wolf was not at the surface, but it was close, closer than it had been in the months since Nadia, pressing upward with the particular insistence of the thing that has been patient for a while, and is running out of patience. He knew this about himself. He had noted it, in the private accounting he kept. He had thought about calling Nadia during the week to say something was pressing and he needed to be careful, which was a thing he had learned to do, which Nadia had made possible by creating a space in which he could say such things without it being a performance or a warning or an imposition. He had not called because he told himself he had it managed. He had been wrong about that. Nadia arrived at his apartment at 7 on Friday evening. She had brought things for dinner, ingredients, not finished food, because they had plans to cook together, which was something they did on Fridays when neither of them had other commitments, a routine that had developed naturally and that Marcus genuinely looked forward to. She came in with her bag and her easy manner and the specific settled quality of someone who is comfortable and glad to be somewhere. He should have told her when she arrived that it had been a difficult week and that he was not at his best. He knew, in the part of himself that was watching carefully, that this was what he should have done. He did not do it because the part of him that was watching carefully was outnumbered, that evening, by the part of him that had been carrying too much for too long, and that had, somewhere in the accumulated exhaustion of the week, stopped having access to the skills he had been building. They were in the kitchen. She was putting things on the counter and talking about something that had happened at her office that day, something involving a scheduling error and a confused supplier, and she was telling it in the light way she told things that were minor, not dwelling on it, just sharing the ordinary content of a day. And she glanced at him and she saw what was happening. She always saw what was happening, and she said gently that she'd noticed he'd been a bit quieter than usual, and she was there if he wanted to talk. It was the gentlest possible version of that sentence. It came from genuine care, from the specific attentiveness of a person who had been paying close attention to him for 5 months, and who had learned to name what she saw, and it came without demand or expectation, only the offer. It landed wrong. It landed on the exposed nerve that the week had uncovered and that the wolf had been pressing against for 4 days, and before Marcus could do anything about it, before the watching part of himself could get there in time, the wolf was speaking, and the wolf did not speak in the careful, considered way that Marcus spoke. The wolf spoke in the language of old pain poorly aimed, and what came out was sharp and precise, in the way that things are precise when they have been shaped by years of knowing exactly where the vulnerable places are. He said he did not need to be checked on. He said it quietly, which was worse than saying it loudly would have been. He said the project of people deciding to be patient with him was its own kind of thing he found difficult. He said other things, more things, things that built on each other in the specific and destructive way of statements made by someone who is hurting, and is using language as the wolf used everything, not to communicate, but to create distance, to push away before they can be left. He watched himself do it. Some part of him stood completely apart and watched every sentence and knew exactly what was happening, and was helpless to stop it. He watched the words land. He watched what happened to Nadia's face. Not a collapse, not tears, not any of the dramatic responses that might have been easier. Her face did something quieter than all of those things. It went still, in the way that means something real has been hit, something underneath the surface, and the still was the specific still of someone absorbing a hurt they had not expected from the direction it had come from. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to go home." He said her name. She said, "I'll talk to you tomorrow." She picked up her bag. She was unhurried. She was not rushing out in anger, and she was not performing a theatrical exit. She was simply leaving, with the quiet completeness of someone who has decided that right now she needs to not be in this room. And this particular quietness, this calm, certain, completely controlled departure, was worse than any other version of it would have been. It said, "I heard what you said and I am choosing not to respond to it right now, and I trust that tomorrow will be a better time." The door closed behind her. Marcus stood in the kitchen, and the wolf retreated, as it always did after the damage was done. Withdrew back to wherever it lived when it was not at the surface, leaving him with the full clarity of what he had just said and done, the specific, awful clarity of someone who has been allowed inside something rare and has just watched his own hands reach out and try to destroy it. He sat down on the kitchen floor for the second time in as many months, but this time there was no one across from him, and the floor was cold, and he was entirely alone, with the echo of his own words and the image of her face going still. He did not call her. He wanted to desperately, and he did not. Because he was honest enough to know that a call at 11 on a Friday night would have been for him and not for her. He typed messages on his phone and deleted them. He cooked nothing. He ate nothing. He sat in his apartment in the specific silence of a man who has made a mistake that cannot be unmade, only answered for, and who is not yet at the stage where answering for it is possible. He had done the thing he had always feared doing. The thing the wolf had always been capable of. He had turned it toward the one person who had never run from it, and he had done it not because he wanted to hurt her, but because he was afraid. He could see this clearly now, in the cold aftermath. He was afraid that she knew him too well. Afraid that the closer she looked, the more certain she would become that she was looking at something she could not sustain. And so some terrified, unthinking part of him had tried to make the decision for her, had tried to give her a reason to go before she found her own. He sat with this understanding for a long time. He did not soften it or find a more forgiving name for it. He let it be what it was. In the morning, a message arrived at 9. She said, "I'm coming over, if that's all right." He replied in under a minute, "Please." She arrived at 10. The morning was clear and cold. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and she said, "I want to say something, and I need you to listen to all of it." He said he was listening. She said what she said. She said his words had been wrong, and she named the specific way they had been wrong. Not wrong in the ordinary sense, not the words of someone who was tired and had spoken carelessly, but the words of someone who had spoken precisely and with purpose, and the purpose was to push her away, and she knew the difference, and she thought he knew the difference too. She said she had been hurt by it, in the way you are hurt by something you did not expect from the direction it came from. She said she was not going to pretend otherwise. He said, "I know. I'm sorry, completely." He said it without reaching for explanation, because explanation in that moment would have been its own kind of evasion, and he was done with evasion, or he intended to be. Not an explanation, an apology. She looked at him for a long moment. She said she knew the difference between those two things. Then she said, "But I'm here. I came back. Not because I didn't hear what you said, because I heard it, and I understood where it came from, and I know the difference between the wolf speaking and Marcus speaking." She held his eyes. "Do not do it again." He said, "I won't." She made coffee. They sat at the table. The winter light came through the window in the cold, clear way of winter mornings, and Marcus looked at the woman across from him, this woman who had heard the worst of what he could produce, and had come back the next morning and sat down across from him and said, "I know where it came from, and I'm still here." He had not thought that was possible. He had told himself, for years, that it was not possible, that there was no one who could both see the thing completely and still choose to remain. He had told himself this so many times and in so many ways that the belief had become indistinguishable from fact. Nadia had just, quietly and without announcement, demonstrated that the belief was wrong. He understood, sitting there, what staying actually required. Not passivity, not endless accommodation, not the martyrdom of someone who absorbs everything without limit. It required the specific and difficult work of returning after being hurt, and sitting back down and saying, "I know what happened, and I know where it came from, and I am choosing, with this information, to remain." Staying was not a passive act. It was the most active choice available. She had made it, deliberately, clearly, with full knowledge of what she was making it toward. He spent the night alone in the aftermath of what he had said, and it was the kind of night that required the honest accounting he applied to everything. He could not excuse it. He could not soften it with context or mitigation. He had said those things. He had meant them to land, and they had landed. The fact that the wolf had been speaking rather than the man did not change the fact that he was responsible for the wolf. He had always been responsible for the wolf. That was the arrangement. He thought about all the times in his life that he had felt this specific terror, the terror of having driven away the thing he most wanted to stay. He had felt it with Clara, at the end, when he could see the withdrawal happening and could not stop it. He had felt it with Liam, earlier, the specific dread of watching someone recalibrate their proximity to him. He had become so familiar with this terror over the years that he had stopped being surprised by it. He had simply accepted it as the predictable cost of being who he was, as the price, finally and inevitably paid, of the wolf's access to language. What was different now was not the terror. It was the understanding he had of why it had happened. He had not, with Clara or Liam, understood clearly what the mechanism was, had experienced the wolf's language as something that arrived and happened to him, rather than something he was participating in, which was not entirely inaccurate, but was incomplete. Now he understood it completely. He had been afraid of Nadia's leaving, and so some part of him had tried to arrange the leaving himself, to control it, to be the one holding the decision, so that the decision could not be made without him. He had done to her what the most frightened version of himself always wanted to do. He had tried to preempt abandonment by becoming, briefly and precisely, the thing worth abandoning. He sat with this understanding for most of the night. He did not spare himself any of it. He let it be fully present, all the ugliness of it, and all the sadness of it, and all the irony of it, that the thing he feared most was the thing he had reached for to protect himself from fearing it. By 3 in the morning he had looked at it from every available angle, and there was nothing left to discover except the fact of it, which was enough. He thought about what she might be feeling, across the city in her apartment. He thought about her face going still. He thought about the quiet completeness of how she had left, not slammed doors, not tears, just the certain, dignified departure of someone who knows her own value well enough not to stay in a room where it has just been diminished. He hoped she was sleeping. He suspected she was. He wanted to call her. He did not call her. He held the phone and he did not call, because calling at that hour would have been for him and not for her. And he had already put himself first once tonight, and once was sufficient, and he was going to be better than that. He did not know how to thank her for this in a way that was adequate to what it was. So he said simply, "Thank you for coming back." She looked at him. She said, "Don't thank me for that." A pause. "Just don't make me have to do it again." He said, "I'm going to try." She said, "I know." He did not become a different man. This is important, and it is the part of the story most likely to be misunderstood, so it is worth saying clearly at the beginning. Marcus did not transform. He was not fixed by what happened, not cured by the specific quality of Nadia's attention, not made whole by being loved in a way that reached the parts of him that previous people had not reached. He remained, in all the ways that mattered, the same person who had sat at a cold kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold 5 months earlier, carrying the same history, shaped by the same things, with the same wolf that had always been in him. What changed was something else entirely, something smaller and more specific and, in the end, more substantial than any of the changes that stories usually allow their people. He changed the way he held it. That was all. That was everything. In the months that followed the kitchen floor and the Friday night and Nadia's return on the Saturday morning, Marcus found that the weight he had been carrying was the same weight but carried differently, in the way that a load is the same load whether one person carries it or two, but the experience of carrying it is entirely unlike. He was not carrying it alone anymore, not because Nadia had taken any portion of it from him. She had not, could not, would not have wanted to, but because he was no longer the only person who knew it was there. The knowledge of it was shared, and the sharing had done something to the nature of it, something he could not fully explain, but could measure by the way the mornings felt, by the specific quality of the evenings, by the difference between going into difficulty knowing that someone who knew the whole picture was on the other side of a phone call. He called his father every 2 weeks. The calls were still brief. His father was still a man of few words, and managed emotions, and the specific distance that had defined their relationship for 30 years. But they were more frequent than they had been, and in the increased frequency, there was a kind of statement, from Marcus to his father, and perhaps from his father to Marcus, though his father would not have used any of these words, that the distance was not infinite, that it had an end, or at least an edge, that they were each willing to reach slightly further across it than they had been willing to reach before. His father met Nadia in the spring. Marcus drove up on a Saturday, and she came with him, and they spent a Sunday afternoon in the small town that had shaped Marcus in all the specific ways that small towns shape the people who grow up in them. His father was quieter than usual, which was very quiet, and Nadia was easy in the way she was always easy, and she talked to his father about a subject she had researched in the 3 days before the visit, because she had learned that his father kept a greenhouse, and she had wanted to have something real to say about it. His father talked to her about the greenhouse for 40 minutes, which was the longest Marcus had heard him speak in a single direction in years. In the car on the drive back, Marcus said nothing for the first 20 minutes. Then he said, "Thank you for the research." She said, "He's good with plants. Better than you." He said, Everyone is better than me at plants. She smiled and looked out the window at the passing countryside, and Marcus drove, and the afternoon was fine and clear, and the road was the road he had taken out of that town at 18, and had returned to many times since, always with the specific complicated feeling that places of origin produce in people who are not sure whether to call them home. But this time the drive felt different. This time the town was something he had shown to someone who mattered, and it had been received not as a place to be endured or explained or apologized for, but simply as the place where he had been made, which was the only honest way to receive it. Owen called in April, from his city 3 hours away, and the call began in the slightly halting way of calls between people who have let too much time accumulate between them. They covered the ground that needed covering, updates, the shape of each other's lives, the careful and affectionate re-establishment of connection. Marcus told him about Nadia. He told it simply, and without embellishment, the same way he told things to anyone who knew him well enough to hear them, without requiring translation. Owen was quiet for a moment after Marcus finished. Then he said, "You sound different." Marcus asked how. Owen said, "Like you've got somewhere to put things." Marcus thought about this. He thought about the river path, and the kitchen table, and the kitchen floor, and the Saturday morning, that had now become many Saturday mornings. He thought about the wolf, which was still in him, and still arrived, and still had the same weight it had always had. He thought about Nadia, and what she had not done, which was fix any of it, and what she had done, which was something entirely different and entirely more permanent. He said, "Yes, I think that's right." Owen said that was good, and meant it. Marcus said he would come up sometime, that they should meet, and he meant that too. Owen said yes. The call ended warmly, without the slight constraint that usually attended the endings of these calls. He sat with the phone after the call, and he was quiet for a while. He thought about Liam's sentence, the one he had carried for years. "You're waiting for something." He had been waiting. He could see now the full shape of what he had been waiting for, and it was not what he would have predicted if he had tried to predict it. He would have predicted something dramatic, something that arrived with announcement, with the force of an event that declared itself as significant. What had arrived instead was this: a woman who brought tea, and sat on the floor, and came back on a Saturday morning, and learned about his father's greenhouse, and did not require him to be smaller than he was, or larger than he was, only what he was, which was, it turned out, sufficient. The wolf was with him, as it always was. He had stopped thinking about this as a condition to be managed, and had started thinking of it as a feature of his particular landscape. Something present, something real, something that told the truth about what had happened to him, and what it had cost, and what it had made him. The wolf was not separate from Marcus. It was part of how he was shaped. Fighting it, or hiding it, or running from it, had never served him. The wolf had only ever responded to one thing, and that thing was not fixing or taming or distance. That thing was the specific act of being accompanied. One morning in the early spring, a Saturday, the kind of clear and cold morning that comes at the beginning of the year before warmth arrives, Marcus woke up before Nadia, which was usual, and lay still for a while and looked at the ceiling, and listened to the city waking up outside the window. The light was very clean. The air in the apartment was warm. He thought about the morning that had started this story, the cold coffee, and the early waking, and the weight pressing up from inside, and the sense of being a man, arranged around an absence, organized by the shape of what was not there, rather than what was. He could remember that morning clearly, the specific texture of it, the way the kitchen had felt when he was in it alone, with the weight, and no one who knew about the weight, and nowhere to put it, that didn't require something to be hidden. This morning was not that morning. This morning was the same man in a different version of his own life, and the difference was not dramatic, and was not complete, and was not any of the things that stories usually require change to be. The wolf was still there. The history was still there. The cost of it, the years of carrying, the exits, the long education in being too much for the space available, none of that was erased, or resolved, or laid gently down. It was all still present, all still real, all still part of the man who lay in the early morning light looking at the ceiling. But Nadia was there too. She was asleep beside him, in the particular, settled way of someone who is entirely comfortable with where they are. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the ceiling again. He thought about what she had done and had not done. She had not saved him from anything. She had not repaired the damage, or filled the absence, or given him something to replace what had been taken from him. She had done something stranger, and harder, and more durable than any of those things. She had looked at him, the wolf, and the weight, and the history, and all of it, and she had chosen to stay. Not once, not in a dramatic gesture, but over and over, in the ordinary way that staying is always done. By showing up the next day and the day after that. By continuing to sit across from him at the kitchen table, and walk beside him on the river path, and be present in the kitchen, and on the floor, and on the Saturday mornings that followed the difficult weeks. She had done the thing that no one before her had done. Not because they were unkind, not because they were wrong to go when they went, but because this particular thing, the staying, the choosing to remain in the full presence of someone's reality, without requiring it to be smaller, or more manageable, or more convenient, required something specific that only Nadia, in all the people Marcus had known, had arrived ready to give. He got up carefully. He made coffee. He brought her a cup when she woke up, and she sat up and took it, and held it in both hands, and looked at him over the rim, with the steady, clear, unperforming eyes he had by now looked into hundreds of times, and in which he still found, every time, the same thing. Someone who was genuinely interested in what was there, and who had decided, with full information, to remain interested in it. The wolf was there, the morning was there, the coffee was warm, and the city was beginning its day, and Marcus was the same man he had always been, and also, in the only way that matters, someone different. He had been the only one who didn't know this was possible. She had known, or she had simply not needed to know in advance, which amounted to the same thing. She had looked at the wolf when it arrived, and she had not moved, and the wolf, enormous and old, and shaped by every loss that had ever made Marcus who he was, had looked back at her, with the specific bewilderment of something that had never encountered a person who stayed, and it had done the only thing available to something that has spent its whole existence in motion when it finally finds, against all its previous experience, that stopping is possible. It had sat down, beside her, and Marcus, on a gray Tuesday morning that had been the last ordinary morning before all of this, would not have believed that this was something that could happen to him. He would have assigned it a very low probability. He would have been honest about the probability, in the careful way he was honest about all things, and he would have continued moving through his life in the shape he had arranged it into, which was functional and real and decent and quietly insufficient. He would have been wrong about the probability, about the shape, about what was available to him in the territory he had decided was closed. She had shown him he was wrong, not through argument or evidence or the patient application of a plan, but simply by being what she was, a person who looked at real things without flinching, who sat on kitchen floors and came back on Saturday mornings, and brought research about greenhouses, and ran the river path on the Thursdays when their timing aligned. A person who had looked at the wolf and found nothing in herself that needed to be somewhere else. That was all it had taken. That was everything it had taken. And Marcus, on a clear spring morning, with warm coffee, in a kitchen that was now theirs rather than his, understood that some things cannot be explained in a way that does justice to what they actually are. Not because they are beyond understanding, because they are exactly as simple as they appear, and simplicity, after years of difficulty, is the hardest thing of all to trust. He thought about what it had cost her. Not in a self-flagellating way. He had done enough of that in the months prior to understand that it was not useful. But in the honest way he thought about everything, which was to look at the actual cost of things, rather than the version of the cost that was most comfortable to acknowledge. What Nadia had given him was not simply pleasant company and genuine care. What she had given him was her own sustained effort over months, the effort of being present in someone's difficult reality, without having that presence be about herself, without making his difficulty an occasion for her to demonstrate her own capacity for it. This was hard work, and she had done it consistently and without complaint, and the fact that she made it look easy was itself a form of generosity. He had asked her once, in the early months, what she got out of it. He had asked it directly, in the direct way of a man who believes that relationships are exchanges, and that exchanges should be transparent. She had thought about it for a moment, and then she had said, I get you, as if that were a simple and sufficient answer. As if the specific person that he was, the wolf and the weight and all of it, were something she was interested in having in her life, not despite those qualities but including them. He had not known what to do with that sentence when she said it. He had held it carefully and carried it forward. He was carrying it still. He was also carrying the understanding that what she had offered him was rare, in the precise sense of rare. Not uncommon in the way that good coffee is uncommon, but rare in the way that things are rare when they exist, because of a specific and unusual combination of qualities that do not assemble themselves often. Nadia's willingness to sit with the wolf was not something that could be asked of most people, and not something most people could have sustained even if they were willing to try. It required a specific kind of security, a person who was secure enough in herself not to be threatened by the size of someone else's reality, not to require that reality to be smaller so that she could feel adequate beside it. She was that kind of person. This was not a thing she had decided to be. It was something she was, the way certain people simply are certain things, without effort and without announcement. He was, in the most honest accounting he had ever done of his own life, extraordinarily lucky. Not in the way people are lucky when good things happen to them by chance. In the specific way that a person who has spent years walking in one direction is lucky when they finally look up and find someone walking toward them in the same light. He had been walking. She had walked toward him. And the meeting of them, on that ordinary Tuesday when everything was already what it was, and nothing had changed and then everything had, was the kind of thing that did not have a better word than lucky, however insufficient that word was for the full weight of what it described. He trusted it. He was still learning how to trust it. He would probably be learning for the rest of his life. The wolf sat beside him in the morning light, and Marcus stayed.